from South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. It's my privilege to chair the Menhaden Management Board. I want to welcome the board members here, welcome our guests, members of the public. We appreciate every one of you being here, appreciate your interest in the deliberations of this board and the work of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. We have before us a couple of things before we get started in earnest, the first of which is an approval of the agenda. The agenda was distributed as part of the briefing materials. Are there any additions to the agenda? I will say it's an ambitious agenda. Mr. Kalin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is an ambitious agenda, but there's also no research planning in this discussion today. I wondered if there could be some time at the end of the meeting to talk about a research program for Menhaden, because it's not on the agenda.
Sure, Jeff. We'll consider that. Maybe, perhaps, we'll see how time allows, but certainly in bounds. Any other additions or suggestions? Seeing none, any objection to adopting the agenda? Seeing none, the agenda is adopted. Also in your briefing materials were proceedings from February 2015, which were also included in the mail-out. Any corrections, additions, or otherwise edits to those minutes? I see none. Those minutes are approved as presented. Now the time on the agenda for public comment, and let me say here at the beginning, I again appreciate the vast turnout from all of you here who are interested in Atlantic Menhaden management. I see a number of you have visual aids. I would just ask that in the course of the deliberations and public comments that you be respectful with those visual aids, please. We have a lot of stuff to go through, a lot of things to talk about, and a lot of interest. So again, we appreciate your being here, appreciate your presence. What we would like to do with public comment now is take public comment on those items that are not on the agenda. I've had one person who has requested an opportunity to speak at this time. Mr. Hastings, if you would come to the public microphone and give us your brief comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I've been doing this too long. The first thing that I remembered about this process that we've been going through for seemingly forever is back when localized depletion was a big deal. So that kind of puts me where I belong in terms of the age spectrum. You never really did anything with localized depletion. It just sort of died, and I don't think you ever even came up with a definition for localized depletion. I was also at the Baltimore meeting. I didn't get a shirt then. I'm kind of disappointed because I got there last, but I got here early today and I have a shirt, so I'm starting off today really, really happy with the way things are going. I was happy at the Baltimore meeting because actually for the first time that I could remember, some conservation issues came to the front, superseded the mere dollar value of these fish, and I was happy about that. That happiness didn't last very long because right behind that was the 6,000 pounds bycatch allowance. I went, whoa, wait a minute now, what's this all about? And it didn't even count toward the target. Imagine how I felt a month or so later when I discovered the bycatch allowance for 1 year was going to go up to 12,000 pounds. And we still didn't know, we didn't know what we had. I also went to the Georgia annual meeting where people showed up, and I thought were really presenting a mea culpa moment because he said, you know, we kind of screwed up. For all those years we caught Menhaden, we weren't reporting them. We didn't know how many we caught. We probably reported a whole lot less than we did, and that's hurting us now because the Commission has established a TAC based on what we reported. We'd like a do-over. We'd like an opportunity to improve on that record, and that was supposed to happen the following winter, but it didn't happen. At that time, it was decided to wait for the compliance reports, and this is something that's always puzzled me, is why, since people had voluntarily said, you know, our compliance reports aren't very good, we don't know what we're catching, we don't know what we're releasing, we don't have any handle on bycatch at all, and suddenly the compliance reports were very important to some people, but not for me. Hopefully things are going to get better. I'm happy to be here today. I'm happy to look around and see that the majority stakeholders have showed up in force, and I'm looking forward to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hastings. For those of you who are waiting to hold your comments for specific motions that the board will be considering. What I would ask you to do, again, we've got a very ambitious agenda. Deke Tompkins, Deke, where are you? Deke is there in the back with the red tie. Stand up again, Deke. Let everybody see you. Say good morning, Deke. Deke, what I would ask those of you to do, again, we have gotten a number of comments. What I would ask those of you who are representing groups or similar perspectives, if you could, in an effort to ensure that your points get across, sign up with Deke. We will try to call on you as motions are made. And if you could designate a spokesperson or two to represent your particular perspective, that would be very helpful to the board and would help us in our deliberations. So if you are so inclined to make public comment after motions are made, would you see Deke Tompkins? And I have neglected a request from our Executive Director, Bob Beal. I apologize to our new members, but we do have a number of new faces around the table, and I'll call on Executive Director Bob Beal to make some introductions. Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I introduced a lot of folks at the Lobster Board meeting yesterday, but that was a much smaller crowd in the room than we have now, and not all the commissioners were around the table. So just want to go over a few introductions just so everybody knows the new faces around the table. We have Senator Brian Langley from Maine, who is back at the commission. He was here before, and now he has returned. So welcome, Senator Langley. From Massachusetts, David Pierce is sitting here as the new acting director of the Division of Marine Fisheries Service. Paul Diodati retired on April 24th. So David's here in a new capacity. Welcome, David, and congratulations. From Rhode Island, we have Eric Reed, who is a new proxy for Senator Susan Sosnowski. And from New York, we have Paul Reese. Paul's backed by Jim Gilmore, and he's a new proxy for Senator Boyle. From Maryland, we have a new legislative commissioner, Delegate Dana Stein, who is over by Tom O'Connell. And we have two new staff members that are in the room. Max Appelman is, no, not here yet. Oh, I'm sorry, over here. Here he is. I'm looking the wrong way. Max is here. And Megan Ware, who is the direction I was looking before. And Max and Megan have recently started at the commission. And so they're both new staff members, new FMP coordinators. Feel free to introduce yourselves to them whenever you get a chance. We also have Craig Pugh from Delaware, who is an ongoing proxy for Representative William Carson, and Craig is backed by John Clark. Welcome, Craig. And I think that is all the new faces around the table. There's quite a few, Robert. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, Bob. To our new faces, new members, welcome. I'm glad you guys are here. Certainly use a lot of wisdom and perspective, so appreciate y'all's presence today. We will move right into our agenda, and the first item is the Biological Ecological Reference Point Work Group Report. Jay McNamee. Jay?
Thank you very much. My name is Jason McNamee. I work for the Rhode Island Division of Fish and Wildlife. I'm also a member of the Biological and Ecological Reference Point Group, as well as the Menhaden Technical Committee. So I've got a report here that will cover our March 26th meeting. And just to refresh your memory a little bit, the last time I was here speaking before this group, we had ended our presentation with this table, and across the top of this table were a number of potential goals or objectives for dealing with Menhaden in an ecosystem framework. And then down the left-hand column there was a number of tools that we were looking at to get at those types of reference points. And at the end of that meeting, what the working group, so it's the burp I'm referring to, I'll just call them the working group from here on out. What the working group was tasked with doing is looking at the single species models, so specifically the Beaufort assessment model, the BAM model, and looking at that in the context of looking at forage services with that. And so it got a little more specific after that meeting, and we were asked to look at the BAM model in the context of the Lenfest report. So that's the Pickich et al. Paper from 2012. So as we made a note in the ERP report, all of these models and ecological reference points that we were looking at in that report were going to require further work by the working group. So what I mean by that is we had come up with a number of tools that we thought we could use, some shorter term, some longer term, but there were a number of tools that we thought we could use, and then based on the goals and objectives that came out of the board, we could then dig a little deeper and review these in more depth. So at our meeting, we reviewed the methodology in the Lenfest report, and the first task that we covered was to figure out which information tier, these are the categories that are set out in the Lenfest report to allow you to look at your forage species and categorize it, and then there's a set of rules that go along with that. So the first step is to figure out which information tier your species is in, and in our case that's Menhaden. So we did that, and then what we did subsequent to that was to evaluate the applicability of the recommended management actions in the Lenfest report associated with that information tier. So some of the findings from our work, a couple of the report recommendations from the Lenfest report. The first is based on the fact that forage species have variable stock dynamics. So because of this variability that's inherent in these forage species, the Lenfest report recommends a more precautionary management for these types of species. It also assumes a stock recruit relationship, and what I mean by that is the notion in the report is if you leave more fish in the water, you have a better chance of not having that population decline dramatically in a short amount of time. And so what we interpreted that to mean is that there's an underlying assumption that there's a stock recruit relationship. If you leave more fish in the water, the chances of having a good recruitment event are higher. So we looked at the report, we looked at the information that we had, and what we did was we classified Menhaden as an intermediate information tier. We did this with strong caveats, which I won't outline here, but were in our report from this meeting. So what the intermediate information tier recommends is that the management actions will have the form of applying a hockey stick harvest control rule. And what that does is it says your biomass limit is going to be greater than or equal to 40% of your unfished biomass. And when you are above that biomass limit, your fishing mortality reference point will be half of your natural mortality. So I'm going to get into a little more detail on these two recommendations from the report. The first is that fishing would be prohibited when biomass levels fall below 40% of unfished biomass. So what you're looking at up there on the y-axis is biomass in thousands of metric tons. Across the bottom is year, and then you have this biomass limit noted on the chart by this, I'll call it orange line. And so you can see there were a couple periods of time when we would have had fishing cease in this fishery, including most recently the mid-90s to the early 2000s. So what the Lenfest report recommends is that when you drop below that 40% of unfished biomass, you cease fishing. The second recommendation is that when biomass is greater than that 40% of unfished biomass, so when you're up above the orange line from the last graph, fishing mortality will not exceed half of the natural mortality rate. So on this graph, what you have is the mean fishing mortality from ages 2 to 4 for Menhaden on the y-axis. The x-axis, again, is year, and the orange line on here is this reference point F equal to half of natural mortality. And you can see that we are currently below that, so that's good. Just a table of the same information, and to give you a little context with regard to where we are at, this table gives you different reference points as well as your terminal year fishing mortality from the most recent BAM assessment. So these, the first two rows there are the threshold and the target. These are the new recommended threshold and targets, and we'll be talking about this, I think, at least 3 more times today. We'll come back to this. But the threshold fishing mortality is 1.26. The target is 0.38. The reference point from the Lenfest report equates to an F of 64% of maximum spawning potential, and that's right around 0.29. And the very last row there is where we are at according to BAM in 2013, and that is 0.22. So we are below all of these different reference points. So now I'll talk a little bit about the applicability of the Lenfest report recommendations. And this was what we discussed at our meeting. How can we apply the Lenfest report recommendations to the Menhaden fishery? So the first thing that we noted was that there's no defined stock-recruit relationship. Again, what I mean by that is for the Menhaden fishery, with the information that we have, it's difficult for us to determine a relationship between the size of your spawning stock and how many recruits you get. There's not a good defined relationship there, and there's no nice curve to say when you have a lot of fish you're going to get a lot of recruits. We see the converse in some situations where we have very few, lower biomass rather, high recruitment, and high biomass and low recruitment. So we have difficulty determining if there is a spawner recruit relationship in this fishery. In addition, in the Lenfest report, the case studies that they looked at, the predators in those case studies were highly dependent. And how they defined highly dependent was that there was greater than or equal to 50% of the specific predator's diet that was comprised of that single forage species. What this does is it creates strong trophic effects. If there are issues with the forage species with these highly dependent predators, there are strong trophic effects for that predator. As well, for Menhaden, the predators that we are aware of that we've done the most research on, they are more opportunistic. So bluefish will eat Menhaden, but they'll also eat pretty much anything else that gets near them. So no predators of interest are highly dependent on a coastwide and annual scale, in our view, for Menhaden, for the Menhaden stock. Now, striped bass may meet this dependency definition, but it's spatially and temporally defined, so we think that they're very dependent on Menhaden in the Chesapeake Bay in the winter, but when you're looking at it in the context of the coastwide stock across the whole year, it's hard to find a predator that is highly dependent per the Lenfest report's definition. So our recommendations, the working group does not believe the reference point recommendations in the Lenfest report are applicable to this system. And it's not that they couldn't be applied, but at this point the working group had enough questions with this and we felt the need to do a little more research on it, that we didn't feel that it should be applied in the specific defined way that it exists in the report to the Menhaden fishery. The working group cannot evaluate if the Lenfest buffers will provide enough forage to sustain predators of interest at desired population levels. Again, what we mean by this is we don't know that simply by leaving more fish in the water that we will be able to maintain a high population biomass, nor do we know what those desired population levels for the predators are. So for those two reasons, we have difficulty in evaluating whether or not the buffers provided in the Lenfest report would be adequate. All that being said, predator removals of Menhaden are a large source of mortality for this stock. We're not saying that it's not. We're not denying that. It absolutely is. We're just suggesting that we should go through a little more work with some of the additional tools that we outlined in that very first table that I showed. So, through the framework of the Ecological Reference Point report, the working group is working to have better ERP advice specific to Atlantic Menhaden management. So we want to continue to investigate the tools that we have available that are more geared towards Menhaden and use those for this task. A couple more conclusions here, and this is at the end of our meeting. We started to brainstorm a little bit about how best to kind of move forward to get to the end goal that we all have in common. And so our recommendation to the board is that they should consider forming a subcommittee to collaborate with the Biological and Ecological Reference Point Working Group and industry to define more concrete ecosystem management goals and objectives. So we can, in this subcommittee setting, identify which models are the most appropriate to achieve our proposed objectives and goals. And then finally, what we would do in the end is combine the recommendations of the subcommittee with those of the Atlantic Menhaden peer reviewers to define an objective approach to developing ecological reference points. So that's what I have, and I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Jay, thank you for that. Questions for Jay? Rob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Jay. And I just wanted to follow up on a couple of things that you indicated. I think you started out by talking about a precautionary approach and that more fish in the water means more success reproductively, even though, as you talked about a little bit, there is a determined lack of a stock recruitment relationship. And if that's a finding, is the best thing that we can do is to make sure that fishing mortality ensures that we maintain a fecundity that is at an acceptable level according to the targets and thresholds that have been set. And I'll have a little follow-up, but if you could address that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so I think that's correct. So when I was talking about the notion of leaving more fish in the water, I was talking about that more in the context of the recommendations of the Lenfest report. The kind of the discussion we had at the working group was that we think that that's probably a very reasonable and logical assumption. We just lacked a quantitative way to prove that for Menhaden. You know, the stock recruit relationship is your classic kind of gun blast look to it. There's no good relationship in that information. So I don't disagree with what you said at all, though. Maintaining a reasonable fishing mortality and thereby, you know, leaving more fish in the water is certainly, it's the approach the board has taken as of Amendment 2. And according to the outcome of the assessment, appears to be effective.
Rob, follow up?
Very briefly, so the lack of a stock recruitment relationship and the idea that we have fecundity thresholds and target, would you indicate that the little bit of a converse of what you said earlier, we're really looking to make sure that there's enough eggs in the water to account for those times when environmental conditions will boost our recruitment, And so it's probably the same thing you were indicating earlier about more fish in the water, but with the fecundity target and threshold, I think would you say more eggs in the water as well, with the way we're managing?
Right. So it's a good point for Menhaden, and it's. I mean, it is used in other fisheries as well, but as far as the commission species that most of us are familiar with, fecundity is a different sort of metric. So that is how we measure the potential for recruitment is by measuring the eggs, and the amount of eggs in the water is actually based on a relationship between the size of the fish and the number of eggs that size fish has. So again, I guess the point the working group was trying to make is sometimes you can have a lot of biomass in the water that produces a lot of eggs, but you still don't get a good recruitment event. So it's my understanding from what this board did previously during Amendment 2 was you were working under the premise that, well, at least we can leave a lot of biomass in the water and make sure there's a lot of eggs in the water so that when environmental conditions and if we believe environmental drivers are what have the greatest effect on recruitment, then we're going to leave that level in the water and hope at some point we get a good set of environmental conditions to have a good recruitment event.
Mr. Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question on your report. Back when you were talking about predator percentages of what they need, you said something about 50%. Is that roughly 50% of the total fish need to be reserved for forage by the predators? Was I understanding that correctly?
So the 50% it's sort of a volumetric type of analysis where we looked at gut contents of striped bass, bluefish, animals like that. So it's the definition in the Lenfest report has to do with the amount of that individual predator's diet that's comprised of a single forage species. So it's not that we need to leave 50% in the water. It's a definition that says predator X requires at least 50% of their diet to be forage species Y. So it has to do with the amount of their diet, the proportion of their diet, not the amount of population.
Dr. Pierce.
I have on occasion referenced the Lenfest report, some of the work that I've done in my agency, also with New England Fishery Management Council. It's a well-done report, many authors with a lot of experience with this particular issue. But when this review was done at the request of the board, and thank you for doing it, appreciate all the effort put into it, were the authors of the Lenfest report, Little Fish, Big Impact, Managing a Crucial Link in Ocean Food Webs, were they present to answer questions, to participate in the debate? I asked the question because now we have a letter from them that challenges the conclusions and recommendations, many of them anyways, made by your group. So were they involved at all during this review of their work?
There were no members from the Lenfest working group were in attendance at that meeting. And just to jump back for a minute, I completely agree with your comments about the report itself. And so what we did at the working group was to review the report, apply the metrics that are outlined in the report to Menhaden. So we did not have any members of the working group, of the Lenfest working group, in attendance at our meeting.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, were they given the opportunity to attend, to participate and answer questions, or not?
I don't know.
Senator Waters.
Thank you, Jay. I had a question about fecundity and environmental factors, which you briefly alluded to. Is there any indication from your work or from other research that the species fecundity is potentially being affected by ocean acidification or warming water temperatures?
I'm not going to answer very directly, just because it's not my area of expertise per se. So there is a lot of research on environmental drivers and menhaden recruitment, not only ocean acidification and water temperature, but currents. And it's this notion of advection into appropriate nursery habitats and things like that. So there is a decent amount of research on these sorts of topics for menhaden, but it's still early on, and there hasn't been a lot of direct work looking, there's been some, but not a lot of direct work looking at recruitment specifically and developing environmental covariates into that relationship to see if that explains some of the variance that we see.
Further questions for Jay? Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Jay, for your report and for the work of the work group. I have a couple of questions. One, aren't most of the predator removal needs already taken into account through M in the assessment? And does this suggest that we need to go back and review really what that estimate of M is and revise it in some way? That's my first question.
So in the context of the single species assessment, the natural mortality vector that we put into the model is supposed to accommodate all of the sources of mortality that exist on that species. So that's the direct answer to your question, that it is supposed to account for all of the natural mortality, predation, getting old, all those sorts of things that aren't related to fishing. However, a lot of the discussion around menhaden is that's good to account for that degree of mortality, but because it's a forage species with a lot of variability in its stock dynamics, you need to be more precautionary with your assumption about how much mortality you can allow on it in either context, fishing or natural mortality. So that is the second part of your question. That's precisely what the ERP group is working on, is looking at ways to develop better mechanisms for estimating and accounting for the variability in that natural mortality through time. So in the past, you had listened to discussions about the MSVPA. That was a multi-species model. There's a couple of new multi-species models that are in development right now. And so all of these things are supposed to not only account for that mortality, but to account for it and its variability through time and fluctuations in predator abundance and impacts to natural mortality and how it relates to that. So that's exactly the type of question that the ERP working group is looking at.
Dr. Hasbrook, one follow-up?
Not a follow-up, a separate question?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Did the work group look at all or investigate the dietary needs of menhaden themselves? And I guess my question really is, menhaden don't graze just on phytoplankton, they graze on zooplankton as well. And some component of that is ichthyoplankton. So is the work group looking at what the impact of increased numbers of menhaden are on other fishes, both forage fishes and predators? You know, some component of the diet of menhaden probably comprised of planktonic stages of other forage species like sand eels, and bay anchovy, as well as predators like striped bass and weakfish. Did the work group take that into consideration at all, or have that part of their discussion?
So the short answer to your question is no, but I will offer that one of the multi-species models that I just referenced a moment ago is EcoPath with EcoSim. It's a coast-wide version, and that is a full trophic model. So that would account all the way down to nitrogen inputs into the system. So, in fact, we are in the longer term sort of looking at that, albeit not very explicitly.
Mr. Nowalski.
Thank you very much. In the absence of the adoption of ecological reference points, we've heard numerous comments from the public directed towards us that we are not fully considering the ecological considerations and the place of Menhaden in the ecosystem. Can you respond to that a little bit with regards to what you believe the advice the TC has given this board in the past has considered those concerns about Menhaden's place in the ecosystem and recommending quotas that we've adopted?
So I will offer you this answer, and that is when the technical committee is developing its recommendations, it to this point is doing so in the context of the single species assessment. So we're looking at Menhaden, its population dynamics, and offering recommendations that account for its population dynamics and its ability to be sustainable through time. During Amendment 2, I think it was the board who adopted a different approach and not going strictly by the assessment results. We didn't have a very good assessment at that time, and built in buffers or what you felt was precaution to account for that. So in the context of the technical committee, we're providing advice per our task explicit to the single species assessment in the context of one species and its ability to be sustainable.
Mr. Stockwell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Jason. I'm just curious about the timeline for the working group to complete your analyses and provide our final recommendations to the board and TC.
I don't have a good answer for that. What I will suggest is right at the end of the presentation, we offered a potential mechanism for at least moving forward in the short term to begin to itemize out these objectives and goals that we need in order to begin to set concrete reference points. At the same time, we had a couple of good presentations given at our meeting on some of the tools that we have in play. In particular, there was a report on the statistical multi-species model that I gave, as well as an update on the EcoPath, EcoSim model. So I'm not I think we actually put a timeline in the report. I don't recall what it is. It's not way off in the future, but certainly not ready today.
Mr. Goldsboro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I feel the need to echo Dr. Pierce's reference to the Lenfest Forage Fish Task Force letter that we all have, because it is co-signed by a well-respected fishery scientist from the University of Maryland, Dr. Ed Hood, who co-chaired the task force. I do want to note and thank Jason for his comment that their intent is not to reject this approach out of hand, but to continue to study it further, because I do think, and I think others will agree if they read this letter, that it offers a lot of promise, actually, for us. I do think that a lot of us around the table at the February meeting were urging the consideration of this approach so that it would give us more latitude at this meeting to make some management judgments, given that it was the only approach to ecological reference points that the analysis in the assessment said was ready to go. So we could get some kind of guidance about how we can account for Menhaden's role in the ecosystem and yet move forward with decisions about the quota, perhaps. But given that we had this report from the BURP work group, I think it ties our hands quite a bit with respect to that. But I would encourage us to continue to give strong consideration to this approach. Thank you.
Further questions for Jay? Ms. Fegley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope this will be a quick question. I'm looking at the target and the array of target fishing mortalities that you guys outlined in your table, and it looks to me like the recommended target coming out of the assessment is F57%, which represents now what appears to be the median fishing mortality rate through the time series on ages 2 to 4. And it looks as though the Pickich et al., if you applied that, you would come to the conclusion that we should fish at F64. And so my question is, did the work group discuss or do any projections? I'm curious about the difference between those two levels. If you were to fish at F64 versus F57, did the group do any projections to look at the impacts of fishing at those two levels on fecundity, biomass, or assessment? And in your opinion, would there be any measurable difference between those two levels of fishing mortality? Thank you.
So the direct answer to your question is we did not run projections on the LenFest reference points, only on the reference points that came out of the peer review recommendations. So we did not project. I think it's relevant to your question as well to jump back to the previous question. I showed the graphs. We did look at the LenFest and analyze those reference points relative to our current stocks data. So we did complete the task. We looked at them per the task and showed you where we were relative to them, what those reference points look like, and so, I feel like we did complete the task. Just I make that comment to the last statement in this letter that we received, and also I have a profound amount of respect for Dr. Hood. I think he's great. I don't know Dr. Pickich as well, but I think we could have had a more collegial discourse over this than how it appears through this letter. I don't think we are terribly at odds with the LenFest report. However, we had to kind of focus in on the task that we were given. I feel that we did that. We also took the step to provide our recommendation, what we felt about those and the applicability of those. That was what I just presented. So all that being said, directly back to your question, we did not project. Therefore, it's difficult to say what the impacts of the LenFest-derived reference points would have on the population.
Further questions from the board? Seeing none. Oh, Mr. O'Reilly, sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to make sure, it looks like Jay is going to talk about review the biological reference points coming up. And so at that time, I'll have some questions, and Jay can help out.
I think Jay will make himself available to your questions, Mr. O'Reilly. Thank you. Further questions from the board? for Jay. From the AP chair, Mr. Kalin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody. Hey, Jay, how you doing? My question, was talking about the burp process, which was a public process. So many of us participated in it. It was a very open process. And thinking about the development of, new models, multi-species models and so forth, my question is about the MSVPAX model, which has been under development for so many years. And what I understand to be kind of the inability of that model to produce repeatable results in the BAM estimate of M2, kind of following on to the question that was asked earlier. But even though that's the case, didn't the BAM model also develop some enhancements to better understand the Menhaden's role in the ecosystem through things like the north-south components of fleets and young of the year and adult indices and so forth? So it's not like that it was done in a vacuum. In fact, I think isn't the BAM model robust to many of those considerations by better understanding kind of the environment that the Menhaden are in and where the resource is being harvested and so forth? And what happened to the MSVPAX estimates in the BAM process?
Okay, so the MSVPA, the reason, let me step back one step briefly and say, in the past, for the Beaufort assessment model, we actually populated the natural mortality vector with the output from the MSVPA, and that's how we incorporated time and age varying natural mortality for Menhaden. The reason why we abandoned that approach for this recent benchmark is we found it's not that the MSVPA was not repeatable, it was. I have to talk into the microphone. Okay. It is repeatable as a standalone model. What we found, though, is it started to produce biomass trends and things like that were different than the single species versions for those different species. And so that's why we felt it was problematic to apply that natural mortality vector matrix really to the BAM model anymore, because they were giving two different answers as far as what your biomass trends are for your important species in that model. So that's hopefully answers the MSVPA part of your question. And I'm very proud of the assessment. I think we made an enormous amount of improvements to it. The fleeting by area, I think, was very progressive. It accounts for not necessarily any of the mortality aspects, but of the differences in the fisheries along this north-south gradient. So I think that was a major improvement in this model. And, in general, we improved the model, I think, pretty much in every regard. So we did also test it and found that it is robust to most things. Some things it is more sensitive to. All of that's outlined in the assessment report. So I think I answered your question there, somewhere in there.
Yeah, I appreciate the response on the MSVPAX, because I wasn't really sure how that was used, but it was used to tune the Laurentian estimates and that you also made, I think, or something like that. So we'll hear more about that later. But
Jay, thank you for a great presentation and some very good answers to some very good probing questions. We did have a request to comment on this from the member of the public. What I would ask, we are already behind schedule. Wanted to speak on ecological reference points. I would like to move that comment towards agenda item 8, discussion of next steps. Takes us to our next item on the agenda from Mike Wayne, which is the FMP review for 2015 and state compliance reports. Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Wayne. I'm the Fishery Management Plan Coordinator for Atlantic Menhaden. I'm going to walk the board through the 2014 fisheries performance. The intent here is to give everybody an idea of how 2014 went before the board considers specifications for 2015 and beyond. This report was on supplemental materials. Where we're at right now is in Amendment 2. We implemented that in 2013. That established the current TAC that we're using, about 171,000 metric tons. Until completion and board action on the next benchmark assessment, that happened in February. So we have an episodic event set aside that is for the New England states when menhaden occur in higher abundance than normal. We've allocated this TAC based on landings history. We have transferability, a bycatch allowance, and a reduction to the Chesapeake Bay reduction fishery harvest cap, as well as some improved timely reporting and biological monitoring. A couple additions. The board extended that episodic event set-aside program through this year, and they also included a reallocation provision to reallocate what was left over to the states if it wasn't used. And then in February of 14, the board passed a motion to manage cast nets under this bycatch allowance. Remember, the bycatch does not count towards the TAC. So let's review where we're at with reference points for a minute. So back in 2011, through actually Addendum 5 to Amendment 1, we implemented a change to the fishing mortality reference points. That change was a maximum spawning potential of 15% as a threshold and 30% as a target. Those were relevant to the status at that point, which was F8% MSP. So fast forward to 2 grueling long years of a stock assessment subcommittee working through everything that they did, and we produced a 2015 benchmark assessment that recommended new reference points. That was peer review recommended geometric mean F ages 2 to 4. You're going to hear a little bit more about that in Jay's presentation next. Ultimately, that's leading to a new threshold and target. The threshold is 26% MSP, and the target is 57% MSP. And then there's matching fecundity reference points that are associated with those fishing mortality targets and thresholds. So using the new recommended reference points that came out of this 15 assessment, the stock is not overfished and overfishing is not occurring. So we are still using interim reference points while the ecosystem reference points are being developed. That was language that was included in Amendment 2 that is still currently where we're at. So let's get into the performance of the fishery. As I mentioned, our TAC is about 171,000 metric tons. Our total harvest, excluding bycatch, was just underneath that, about slightly underneath the TAC, but a 1.5% increase from 2013. Bycatch this year increased from last year up to 3,000 metric tons approximately. It represented 1.8% of the coastwide harvest, but remember that does not count towards the TAC. So in terms of performance, we're just underneath the TAC again this year. But in terms of total harvest, if you included that bycatch in it, we are slightly over the TAC. By fishery, reduction harvest was just over 131,000 metric tons. It's a very marginal increase from 2013 and a 17% decrease from the last 5-year average. Bait harvest was just over 37,000 metric tons. That's a 7% increase from 13 and a 21% decrease from the last 5 years. This is just a graphical representation of the landings history for this fishery going back to 1940 through the current year, 2014. You can see in the blue line that landings historically have been much higher for the reduction fishery and have since leveled out at a lower level. And then the bait fishery has increased in more recent years, and then through the TAC has been decreased in 13 and 14. Now remember that bait reporting has improved So that factors into some of this landings history as well. So let's talk about the bycatch. In 14, as I mentioned, bycatch increased 60% from 2013. So more fish being landed under this bycatch allowance. You can see this table represents the bycatch pounds by state. It also shows the gear types that were being used. Once again, a large amount of bycatch coming out of the Chesapeake Bay region, but pound nets and gill nets. We also had some bycatch in the Mid-Atlantic and a state in New England and in the South Atlantic as well. So bycatch being used, remember the board had went through action to treat the cast net fisheries under the bycatch allowance, and so that is represented in this table as well. So in terms of analyzing this a little further, we've got a bulk of the bycatch trips landing less than 1,000 pounds. We have a 6,000 pound bycatch allowance, but not a lot of trips are harvesting that amount. A bulk of these bycatch trips are for less than 1,000 pounds. We took this a step further. This was a relatively late request on my behalf as Plan Review Team Chair. I was reading through the proceedings from last year and picked up on the board wanting to see more information about these bycatch trips. And so this table represents the percent. These are bycatch trips only, so trips that were deemed bycatch in the compliance reports. And it represents a percent of menhaden that were caught on that trip relative to all other species. So this is summed across all gears and across all trips, just to give the board an idea that on these bycatch trips, a lot of what's being harvested is menhaden. And I will update that table before we finalize this report. And thank you to the states that were able to turn that around quickly for me. So in terms of the episodic events set aside, we had one state that declared participation in 2014. That state harvested less than 300,000 pounds, so not a lot of pounds landed under this set aside, and the unused set aside was then reallocated to the coastal states on November 1st. In terms of the quota performance, this table breaks down what each state landed in 2014 towards the quota. It also shows any overages that occurred. We had two states that had overages, Rhode Island and New York. In terms of, there were no quota transfers that have existed up until this point to cover those overages. The way that the Menhaden Amendment 2 is written, states are responsible to pay back those overages if they don't receive transfers to cover them pound for pound the following year. So in terms of reporting, New York has monthly reporting but has the capability of requiring weekly reporting if needed. They had a quota overage in 14, so the PRT is making a recommendation that the board consider more timely reporting in New York. Rhode Island had an overage, but it occurred because basically as they were going to close their fishery, a lot of pounds got landed at the very last minute, and that was the reason for their overage. It wasn't a reporting issue per se. All of their states implemented timely reporting to track their quotas. Amendment 2 also required biosampling to occur based on the amount of pounds that are landed by state. This was so that we could provide length and age information so that we could have a more robust stock assessment. This information proved very useful for the 15 assessment and will also prove useful moving forward. The good news here is that all states were able to meet those biosampling requirements. I'll also update the board that we had a Menhaden aging workshop recently in which a lot of the states sent members of their agency so that they to the Beaufort lab so that we could learn the best aging practices for Menhaden. As we pick up this biosampling coast-wide, we want more people to be able to age these fish so that we can get these samples in a timely manner and not rely specifically on the Beaufort lab for that sampling. We did have a CPUE index requirement. This was another requirement we put in Amendment 2. The intent behind this was to get more information into the stock assessment. If you remember, the last iteration of this stock assessment relied solely on a fishery-dependent index coming out of the Potomac River. The idea here was, if we're using that index, can we use other indices from other areas? The stock assessment subcommittee did a huge vetting of all data sets available to them in this 2015 assessment. They decided not to go with fishery-dependent indices and instead go with fishery-independent. This was survey data specifically. Our fishery is moving so quick. Amendment 2 had this requirement, but the stock assessment didn't end up using those specifics in 2015. In terms of the reduction fishery harvest cap in the Chesapeake Bay, this was also reduced when we reduced harvest through Amendment 2. In 2014, they harvested approximately 45,000 metric tons. That was well underneath their cap of 98,000 metric tons approximately. And so for 15, the harvest cap gets that rollover again for that 98,000 metric ton cap. De minimis for Menhaden, the states of Maine, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida have requested that for the 2015 fishing season. All states have met that because their bait landings in 14 did not exceed 1% of the total coastwide bait landings. And as a result, the PRT recommends that those states be granted de minimis status. Just to remind the board, de minimis exempts those states from collecting biological samples, those age and length samples I was talking about earlier. Even though it exempts a lot of these states, a lot of them are still collecting those samples. They don't have a lot of landings to really require them to collect them anyways. So that's really the only exemption that occurs through de minimis status. So in terms of wrapping this up, the PRT recommendations are to accept the 2015 Fishery Management Plan review for Menhaden and to consider a reporting timeframe for New York. Consider this 60% increase in the bycatch landings. This bycatch allowance is obviously becoming more popular. And then also consider the de minimis request as just stated. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mike. Questions from the board for Mike. Mr. White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excellent report as usual, Mike. The report starts out using metric tons, and then when we get into the tables, it's switched to pounds. And I understand the reasoning for that, but it would be helpful for me if you could also show metric tons next to the pounds to kind of keep those numbers in perspective to the overall total.
Ms. Fegg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mike. I feel compelled to just put two things on the record for the state of Maryland. One is I just want to say again that the only gear in our state that is allowed the 6,000 pounds is pound nets. The gill nets operate on a 1,500 pound bycatch. I also wanted to say that when we submitted our bycatch report, pound nets are a stationary fixed gear. It is an opportunistic gear that collects whatever passes through at the time. So when a school of Menhaden passes by a pound net, the percentage of Menhaden in that gear will be very high. The fishermen cannot necessarily anticipate when schools of Menhaden are going to pass through, and they can't take down and deploy their nets to avoid that. The only thing they could do is rule those Menhaden out. In some cases, that'll result in high mortality. So my point is that from a pound net perspective, to consider the percentage of bycatch only on the days when Menhaden are landed is a little bit, we need to be careful how we interpret that. So we would argue that the bycatch is a function of the season in which the net is there, because the fishermen are making money off of other fish like striped bass and catfish, perch, bluefish. Those are the money fish. So I just want to put on the record that if you were to look at the percentage of Menhaden in our pound net landings, during the time those pound nets are under the bycatch allowance, that number drops to 63%. Thank you.
Mr. Blue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mike. One comment and one question. My comment is just that with regard to the episodic event set aside, I think you characterized the landings at about 300,000 pounds as not a lot. And that's true relative to the overall size of the set aside. However, for a state like Rhode Island, which did opt in and did take advantage and did in fact land those pounds, that's 4 times the amount of our quota. So it remains a very important program for the states in New England, certainly for Rhode Island, and I just want to note that for the record. The second question I have is with regard to transfers. Rhode Island is one of 2 states that did have an overage. Ours was very slight, and thank you for your characterization as to how it occurred. It was we have a well-managed program, and the overage occurred in the 1 day prior to the actual closure of the fishery that had already been enacted. I know discussions are in place as we speak with regard to states that had underages to try and rectify that for 2015. I just read Amendment 2, and I don't see any indication in Amendment 2 about deadlines or timeframes for working through the transfer provisions. So my question to you, Mike, as FMP coordinator, is this something that needs to happen at this moment or at this meeting or perhaps later today in terms of state discussions to try to resolve the overage issue? Thank you.
Yeah, there's no specified time frame for the transfers. I mean, I think it's up to the board if it's acceptable to them to allow for a transfer to occur at this point. There's nothing in the plan that prevents that. I think the sooner the better, just because we're quickly wrapping up the 2014 fishery performance and proceeding through this agenda into 2015. So that's all I'll say about that.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think in everything we do, the bycatch and how we manage it is going to be important going forward. So I wanted to understand better the Table 1 results, which is the state-by-state performance with their quota. And I'm not clear how much consistency there is among states and what's counted toward the quota and what is not. We in Connecticut simply count everything, even though all of our fisheries are very small, toward the quota. And then if we reach the limit, we would, continue to implement our 6,000-pound trip limit, which is what we have. But I heard Lynn mention that they have a smaller bycatch limit for certain gears. And I guess the example would be, for me, would be New York, to help understand, how they had an overage and what constituted an overage. It probably didn't happen late in December. They probably saw it coming, but I'm also suspect that not much of that catch came at quantities greater than 6,000 pounds. So in a sense, a lot of it would not be an overage, but could be considered bycatch. Can you help me with that? And maybe Jim can help after.
Yeah, Jim, I'll start. So the way Amendment 2 treats bycatch, it defines it as any trip that occurs that captures Menhaden after the directed fishery has been closed. So up until the point in which a state closes its Menhaden fishery, all those pounds count towards the quota. And then pounds landed after the fishery is closed count towards bycatch. Now, one step further is that addition that the board made back in 2014 to treat cast nets under the bycatch allowance. So the change there was everything that I just told you, except cast nets, anything landed by that gear counts towards the bycatch allowance, regardless of whether the season is open or closed.
Jim, you want to add to that?
Am I next, Mr. Chairman, in the list, or have I?
Actually, you are. So.
Okay, good, and I'll take advantage of both. Instead of adding to that, because it really goes right into my theme about what we're spending too much effort on, maybe, is I'll start with Richie's comment. We clearly need to have the same set of units because, and just so you know, Richie, there is a great app you can download, the metric ton converter. So if you take the 171,000 metric tons and you convert that to pounds, it's 377 million pounds. Okay, so there's our TAC. And now I have a 200,000 pound overage, which I think is a 20th%. So getting to the real point of we can consider weekly reporting, whatever, so I'll quickly get to shutting my fishery down on this pittance of an amount. So I think we can get into the detail about how we're tracking this, but I think we really need to stay a little bit higher up on should we even be tracking this.
Mr. Simpson, follow up.
Yeah, thanks. So I'm still trying to understand how big New York's problem is. If that 200,000 pounds came in after the quota was filled, as Mike described it, did all of that come in at over 6,000 pound blocks, or were they 2,000 and 3,000 and 4,000 pound blocks, which to me would be bycatch and not count as an overage?
Yeah, Melissa's putting up the bycatch trip analysis just to show you that there were very few bycatch trips that landed in excess of 6,000 pounds. So this is, no, back, yeah, that one right there. So you can see that this is all states combined. I do have this analysis by state, but because of confidentiality issues, I wasn't able to show that. But essentially, this captures the pattern or the trend by state for the bycatch.
Dave?
So this table for New York would be very enlightening. In other words, were any of their trips among the 103 that landed over 6,000 pounds? Because my understanding of the amendment would be that unless they were, they would not count as an overage. So does New York have an overage or not? I suspect if they do, it's very, very small. They have some trap nets that might catch more than 6,000, but I don't think their gill nets or cast nets are doing that.
Jim, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the issue here was that the directed fishery for Menhaden was not closed early enough, and so there were pounds landed before that fishery closed that resulted in the overage as defined in Amendment 2, even though likely these fisheries were the same fisheries that were occurring before the fishery, while the fishery was open and after the fishery closed as well. So I think this was a logistics issue in terms of tracking the quota and closing the fishery in enough time to stay within the quota as defined in Amendment 2 before those pounds started counting towards the bycatch allowance. Does that make sense, Dave?
Yeah, I think so. It's beginning to sound like if New York had a rule and implemented it that said, looks like we caught our quota, we're at 6,000 pound trip limit. If they did that, then none of this would have counted as an overage.
Jim?
Yeah, and recall what we did and why we're in this pickle was that we didn't have mandatory reporting until 2011. So this thing evolved, and we were not having good compliance. That's been ramping up. So we're sort of basing what we're doing on harvest on the previous years. Every year it's gotten better. So yes, suddenly we're seeing that the directed fishery is higher than what we thought, and it looks like it's going to be higher again this year. So we're probably harvesting somewhere in the vicinity of 1 to 2 million pounds in that fishery. But and now we're getting the data to verify that. But unfortunately, we have a moving target trying to manage this.
Dr. Simpson. Excuse me, Dr. Pierce. Excuse me.
Massachusetts has been very careful with regard to how we manage our state share of the Menhaden quota. And as a consequence of the way we have proceeded, we have had an underage. Not a grand scale underage, but enough amounts that we can consider reallocating to some other states, transferring to some other states. So just as a point of information, especially in light of Bob Allou's point about transfers, by the end of Thursday, we will have continued our discussions and concluded our discussions, certainly with Rhode Island and other states that may not have approached us yet, to work out some transfer provision that will account for all or maybe some of those other states' overages.
Dr. Pierce, thank you for that. That actually got to a question I had for staff, if we can handle that through letters, and staff will be available to help you with that. I think, Bob, that'll help Rhode Island with their situation. I have next Mr. Grout.
Question and a comment. Question for Jim. Have you been seeking transfers to account for the overage?
We just found out about the overage from Mike last week. So yes, we were going to take Dr. Pierce up on his his offer in his new role. I'm sure he'll be very gracious. Thank you.
And the follow-up comment about overages and when the payback should occur. I mean, clearly, I think we should have the accounting done before the next fishing season, so that we know what your quota is going to be for the following fishing season. And that may be something that we have. I realize there's nothing in the plan right now that says that, but it may be something we want to think about for a follow-up management action to try and put some boundaries on this.
Mr. Borden.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Dr. Pierce for assisting us with the overage in Rhode Island. I think it's totally appropriate that as his first official act as the acting director, he bailed out his good friends to the south. A couple of points on bycatch, and this goes back to Jim Guilford's comment. I mean, we have what I view as a fundamental problem, and it goes back to the original allocations that were made in the state quota system. And I realize this is a point for questions, so I'll just make this very brief. It's just a statement. We're not going to solve this problem until we go back and readjust the original quotas. If you have states like Rhode Island and New York that have very small allocations and they have gear types that can literally catch the quota in one day, it's almost impossible to manage that for a state agency to manage that. So I think the resolution of not only Rhode Island's problem, but New York and a number of the states is we have to go back and do some adjustments on the state allocation formula. The second point I would make is that the bycatch allowance, if I understood Mike during his presentation, he said it does not count towards the quota. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so I pointed this out before. To me, it's just like a disconnect in the logic here. All landings, as far as I'm concerned, should count towards the quota. That's just something we have to fix in the plan. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly.
I have a different question, but first I want to ask, is there a possibility that we can move forward with some type of structure, some type of work group at some time to look at bycatch? It's been a mess since we talked about it in December of 2012. We know how that went. 6,000 pounds was after many other ideas were formed. We've had problems since then. Florida, New York reporting, Florida DipNet. The history's there. It says we should really talk about it. Lynn Fegley's comment about the pound net is a real good comment. As concerning monitoring, unless you have daily monitoring, which I don't think anyone has daily monitoring very well, you can really get in trouble fast. So I know that in Virginia, even though we can project, without daily monitoring, you can only project so much. We went over, it does get subtracted from the 2015 quota, pardon me, about 190,000 pounds. So things happen quickly. We really need to talk about this as a complete part of the plan rather than a side part. My question, if I may, though, is on aging. And Mike, I guess I appreciate your report, but I'm not sure where things stand. I know there are collections made. I know there was a workshop. We talked to Dr. Jones and Dr. Lau at Old Dominion University about 10 days ago. They are wondering what the schedule is going to be for as we go forward with aging. I think they're just archiving samples that have been collected by VMRC at this time. So is there a plan to move forward with some type of aging protocols as far as numbers of scales to be aged, number of otoliths to be aged, whatever the currency is going to be? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. So we're currently finishing up that aging workshop report. The workshop report will detail the procedure for handling the fish, collecting the scales, aging those scales, walking through the whole procedure. It also is going to identify like the people, the agencies that were in attendance, and we plan to work with those agencies to determine their comfort level with aging the samples on their own, based off of this protocol that was established at the aging workshop. As part of that discussion, we will also identify the time frame in which they think they can fit this into all the other age samples that they have to look through for the other species. Excuse me. So the short answer is it will be a follow-up for the aging workshop report.
Mr. Stockwell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As Mike's presentation indicated, Maine had very low landings last year. I'd be happy to contribute the balance of our extraordinarily large quota to Rhode Island and New York. So we can talk after the board concludes.
Further questions from Mike on the fishery review for 2014? All right, this is an action item. We're looking for a motion. Dr. Daniel.
Move we approve the compliance review, and that would, my intent would be to include those de minimis requests, Mr. Chairman.
All right, motion by Dr. Daniels. Is there a second by Mr. Adler? Discussion on the motion? Any objection to the motion? Seeing none, that motion carries. Joe, do you have that? Okay, the states are Maine. Okay. Let me read it for the record. Dr. Daniel moved to accept the 2014 FMP review report and approve the states of Maine, New Hampshire, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida for de minimis status for the 2015 fishing season. Dr. Daniel made that motion. Mr. Adler was seconded. Motion passed with no objection. Next item on the agenda, let me just give the board a time check. It is 9:30 by my watch. We are a little behind, and we have a number of guests here who I know are very interested in our discussion. So I just ask you help me keep us on board and on time, please. So we will go back to Jay for the TC report.
Okay. I think Melissa's there. It is. So this is another presentation. This one focuses in now on the BAM model and projections that we ran in relation to the biological reference points. So just by way of outline, I'll hit on two things in this presentation. I'll try to move along relatively quickly here as well. So we're going to go over the recommended biological reference points. You've seen these already a couple of times, so we'll try and tick through those pretty quick, but keep in mind that what we're talking about with Menhaden is fishing mortality and fecundity. The fecundity is what we use instead of a biomass reference point. And then the second half of the presentation will go over the projections, and we looked into some risk analysis with these projections, the risk of exceeding the F target and threshold under various scenarios. So just by way of background, the current reference points, so these are the currently established reference points for the Menhaden fishery, are not applicable with the results of the most recent assessment information. So what the technical committee did was we proposed new reference points in the stock assessment report. And so at your February meeting, you tasked the technical committee to go back and review the peer review report. And so at the time, we had recommended, and this was keeping in line with what we had recommended previously, but we said F at age 2 is what we should use for our fishing mortality reference point. The reason for age 2 is the bulk of the harvest is coming out of that age class, so we thought that was a logical way to develop the fishing mortality reference point. However, the review panel recommended grabbing a few more ages, and their recommendation was based on the fact that your fishery can change. So to account for the fact that selectivity may change through time, they suggested we use a geometric mean fishing mortality for ages 2 through 4. We thought this was a good idea, and so we agreed with that recommendation. So given the recommendations from the review panel, what we are using is a maximum spawning potential based reference point, and it's determined using the years from 1960 to 2012. And within that time frame, we are looking at the minimum and the median value of MSP. The fishing mortality rate, as just mentioned, is going to be the geometric mean of ages 2 through 4, and then the associated fecundity reference points that goes along with these Fs here. So that's F 26% of MSP, F 57% of MSP, and then the analogous fecundity reference points with those F fishing mortality reference points. So the bottom line of the determination is that the stock is not overfished and overfishing is not occurring relative to these recommended reference points. So here's another look at the information in a table. So you have the threshold amount, which is the 26% of MSP. That is 1.26. You then have your target, which is 0.38. And you can see that F in 2013 is below both of those, 0.22. It equates to roughly an F of 70% of maximum spawning potential. To go along with that, your fecundity threshold is 86,000, roughly 87,000 eggs. The fecundity target is almost 190,000 eggs, and the fecundity in 2013 is, I'm sorry, that's billions, I think, actually. In any case, the level in 2013 was 170,000. Here's a graphical look at the same information. Mean F at ages 2 to 4 is on the y-axis, year across the bottom. Your target is the orange line. The threshold is the blue line. You can see we are below both. Same with fecundity. The blue line is your, again, your threshold. The orange line is your target, and we are just below the target, but above the threshold. So in 2014, the TAC, so this is going to talk about now the setup for the projection. So I'm moving from the reference points into the projection discussion. In 2014, the TAC was roughly 171,000 metric tons. The duration of the projections was short term. We went from 2015 to 2017. And the reason for this is it maintains at least one age class that we have information on in the assessment through the projection. Once you get beyond 2017, you're relying on the model, the projection estimated recruitment. So things tend to stabilize after that and add some uncertainty into the analysis, a lot of uncertainty. We did 6 runs using a constant harvest approach, and then we did 1 run using a constant F approach in the projections. So 7 projection scenarios were done altogether. Just to run through these, I'll go through these real quick. This is a sort of a tough slide, but so the average catch from 2009 to 2011 prior to the implementation of Amendment 2 would have been roughly 213,000 metric tons. And then what each projection beyond that does up to number 5 is it scales it back by some proportion. So first, if it was 5% lower than that average catch is roughly 203,000 metric tons, 10% is run number 3, 15% is run number 4, and then number 5 is sort of your status quo approach, and that is a 20% reduction. That's what we did with our last management action. Number 6 is a little bit different, and what that does is it looks at what your TAC, your total allowable catch, would need to be in 2007, well, in each year up to 2017, so that in 2017 you're achieving a 50% probability of hitting your F target. So that's a constant catch approach, and it's looking out at your the 2017 year to gauge what your catch needs to be. And then number 7 is developing a TAC in each year that has a 50% probability of achieving your F target. So the difference between 6 and 7 is run 6 is going to have a single catch that gets you to some level in 2017. Number 7 is going to have different catches in each year because what you're trying to achieve is a static F through time, not a static catch. So here's a table that's looking at some of the risk associated with the runs 1 through 5. So these are your constant catch strategies, scaling your catch back from your average catch during that reference period of time. And so I won't go through the whole table, but what you can see is in all cases you have at least a 50% chance of exceeding the F target in your first year, but then it scales back after that, and that has to do with the dynamics of how the projections are run. So the very top one, which would be status quo, puts you right at about 50% in 2015, but then drops back only a 23% in 2016 and only a 3% chance of exceeding the F target. And you can see how all of the different scenarios interact with the reference points. The table down below is the interaction with the threshold, and the takeaway from that table is all of them have only a very small chance of hitting the threshold. A little more detail on projection. That was projections 1 through 5. Here's projection 6. This is the TAC that has a 50% probability of achieving the F target in 2017. So that was 246, roughly 247,000 metric tons. And so that TAC would be held constant for a 3-year time period. And then down below is your risk associated with that. So pretty high risk of exceeding your target in 2015 with that. Then it scales back to 50% in 2017. The percent risk of exceeding your F threshold is lower. So the final projection, this is the one where you're going to have a variable quota through time. The TAC that has a 50% probability of achieving the F target in each year. And so what you can see is in year one, you'd have a TAC of 173,000 metric tons, so just a little bit above what we had in 2014 for a TAC. And then it goes up from there, 224 and then 266,000 metric tons in each subsequent year. The risks associated with that are in the two bottom rows. All right, so a couple of caveats here. The projections are highly uncertain. If you looked through the report on this, you can see the wide bounds around these projections because there's a lot of uncertainty. One of the main sources of uncertainty that we have are that we didn't include any structural uncertainty into these projections. So this would be the process error associated with the stock assessment model. We did not account for that in the projections. The projections are also conditional on a set of functional forms. So for selectivity and recruitment, we make a choice and then move those choices forward in time. And so if those choices that we made for our projections don't end up being correct, that adds uncertainty into those estimates. In addition, the fisheries were assumed to continue at the current proportions of total effort using the current selectivity. So what that means is if the proportions, if more gets harvested by the bait fishery in the north relative to the reduction fishery in the south proportionally, that's going to change the outcome of these projections because the projections that we did held those as they are now static through time. A few more projection caveats. If future recruitment is characterized by runs of large or small year classes, possibly due to environmental or ecological conditions, these will affect the stock trajectories that we have outlined here in our projections. So our assumptions about recruitment and what ends up happening in reality have a strong influence on what your projection information would be. In addition, the projections apply the Baranov catch equation, and so this assumes that the time step in the Baranov equation is a year. So it assumes that the fishing mortality is occurring throughout the year. So if management gets more complex with seasonal closures and things like that, this will impact the outcome of the projection. Here's another look. I think this also showed up in Mike's presentation, but here's a look at the current allocations per Amendment 2. I'm sure you're all fairly familiar with those, but you can see a small proportion of the harvest is allocated New York North. Most of it is happening New Jersey South. So there will be a quiz on this table at the end, so be sure to memorize all those numbers. All kidding aside, this just breaks out into a question asked earlier. Because we manage in pounds, the body of the information in this table is in pounds, just to make everyone aware. Metric tons is across the top, and the reason that is across the top is so you can see which scenario you're looking at here. So I'll wait another minute to let you take a peek at your state and where you end up under these different scenarios, and then I will bounce to what is the final slide, which shows the final projection, same information. And so here is projection 7, and we can flip back at any point during your questions and deliberations. But here is your projection 7. This is the one where the quota changes in each year, and here's how that breaks out for the different states. And that is my final slide, and I am happy, Mr. Chair, to take any questions.
Jay, again, thank you for a yeoman's job with this. Again, remind the board where we are schedule-wise. We're a little behind time, so I'll ask for questions on Jay's presentation. Dr. Daniel.
Can you give some direction of the uncertainty, or is it just all over the place?
Yeah, it is. It goes in both directions because it depends. For instance, recruitment, if you have a run of low recruitment, your projection will be less conservative. If you have a run of high recruitment, it will be more conservative. So it goes in both directions. There's no easy answer to figure out which way the risk is.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again, Jay. And I have a few questions, but I'll be polite and try and do one now, and maybe you can call on me later. Jay, you already answered one of my questions. We had a brief discussion about the Lenfest situation and the projections from that fishing mortality rate, and you noted that it's about 70% is where we are now if we look at an MSP value. So that's even higher than Lenfest or the 57% that's promoted through the peer review process. And I would guess that if we looked at exploitation, it might even be a wider gap between Lenfest and the 70% because this is fishing mortality. And I didn't see the exploitations, but that's fine. I do want to ask you, though, from the analysis, there's such a buffer between the threshold and the target. It's always been there. I've never understood this. I've always been kind of amazed. I've looked at a number of species of somewhat similar life histories, different life histories for the MSP. But even going back to Amendment 1, that buffer has always been large for Menhaden. You know, you have to look really hard, and I haven't found a species that has that type of strategy. Put that aside, do you think the analysis that have been done, if there is a constant catch situation, and you've promoted a few of them in constant F, would you think we would be varying around the target, and that's about it, given the constant catch, given the experience that everyone's been through with the assessment and through the peer review? Is that a safe assumption to think that with the constant catch we would be varying around a certain F, a little bit above maybe the target, a little bit below? And I think that's pretty classic, is the way it's been described to us before about having a target.
Yep, so I agree with your statement. So I think based on the selections we made for the projections, the outcome is that, you know, by design, that based on the scenarios that we presented, you're going to vary around your target in a distributional way. You know, the central tendency of the projection is that 50% value, and that's what we kind of use to gauge and produce those constant catch scenarios. So, so I think what you said is correct.
Mr. Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two tables you have here, Table 6 and Table 7. I think you've got 7 up there now. And I'm trying to understand that on Table 6, it looks like if the metric ton numbers were increased from 170 or 171 to 181 to 192 or whatever, that the various state allocations would go up based on what the total TAC goes up to. And yet on Table 7, are we assuming that if you stay at 171,800 or whatever, that it looks like the allocations in 2015, 16, 17 will go up as well? And I just wanted to know, on Table 7, is that given the TAC that we have now, and that it would go up in 2016, 17? And what's different in Table 6 is that this one requires us to raise the total allowable catch up to some number above 170. Could you explain which is different here? What's going on?
Yep. No, a good question. It's tough, and I should have maybe approached it in this way. So, in Table 6, what you're looking at are your individual runs from projection number 1. So the first column there with 170,800, that is your status quo projection. So that was a single projected run, and each of these only get a single column because we are holding the catch constant throughout the 3 years of projection. So 170,800, that's the status quo. 181,475, that was, I think, your 15% reduction. So each column represents a single run. The difference with Table 7 is this is a single run, and the reason why we had to show the single run in its standalone table is because the catch increases in each year to go after that 50% of the F target. So it depends on the metric. So the table in the previous slide is you're going to pick a catch number and run that forward in time for 3 years. In the second table, you're trying to achieve an F target in each year, so it goes up in each year. I don't know if that was helpful at all, but I hope so.
Mr. Ballou.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Jason. I'm looking at Table 2 in your report, and I understand that the probability of exceeding the F target decreases over time because of the recruitment assumptions within the projections. I know that because that's exactly what the report says. So my question is, as you look at the probabilities, they're relatively high in 2015, and then they decrease in 16 and 17. Does it therefore follow that if any potential increases in the TAC were delayed a year, that the risk would decrease, or would it just simply push the 3-year analysis or the 2-year analysis that may be out? Do you understand my question? I'm trying to see how we might avoid high-risk decisions and perhaps settle on lower risk, and it almost looks like that if we just waited a year, the 16 and 17 percentages risk levels are much lower. Am I misreading this, and is this just about simple model exercises and not reality? Thank you.
Yep. No, it's a good question, Bob. So I understand kind of the notion that you propose. However, what would the most reasonable way to accomplish what you're talking about, say we waited a year, what we would do is try to look at the most recent information and rerun the projections, and it may just produce the same table over again. So this is the risk, according to the selections we made for the projections, static. If we wait a year, the environment changes, the projections will also change. So it's more complex than that. So simply waiting a year won't necessarily decrease your risk.
Dr. Pierce.
You were very careful with regard to the listing of why the projections are highly uncertain, so I appreciate that. It's always good to know how uncertain the projections are. Regarding the uncertainty, I've got a question that relates to Table 2 and Table 3. Well, actually, on the screen, projections 1 through 5. You make a very important point, you and your group make a very important point about recruitment. And you highlight that you used median recruitment with the variability based on historical recruitment. But then you make a very important statement after that, and you say that this means that using median recruitment with historical variability ultimately results in higher levels of recruitment in the projections than recently observed. So my question is, what have we recently observed, and to what extent do those recent observations perhaps counter or diminish the accuracy of the projections that we've been given?
Yes, very good observation, and was very much why we added those comments explicitly in the report. So the most recent period of time, towards the terminal end of the stock assessment time series, there's been lower than average recruitment. So that's why we presented it in this way. It's a judgment of risk as to whether you think that will propagate forward at a low recruitment level, or whether you think you're bound to have some more median level or perhaps high level of recruitment sometime within the next 3 or 4 years. So it's a judgment of risk. We have no empirical way to judge that. As I mentioned, the reason we're using median with deviations around that median for the projections is because we don't have a stock recruit relationship like I talked about in my first presentation today. So that's sort of the idea. I think I'm just reiterating what you were asking, but it's a judgment of risk, and it depends on what you believe the new current state will be in the next couple of years. Will determine what you feel the actual risk is in these projections.
Just one quick follow-up. What years then have the lower recruitment? 2013, 14? Can you give us the recent years when we've had this lower levels of recruitment?
Yeah, I'm a little hesitant, but I'll give it a shot. And I wish I had Joe Smith sitting to my right who could come up with the dates immediately. So I think I feel comfortable saying the most recent 2 to 3 years going backwards in time had a lower than median recruitment, but then prior to that there were a couple years in the last 5 to 10 years where we had a higher degree of recruitment, again, according to the stock assessment model. So it's not that we are relying on recruitment events that we haven't seen since the 60s. There have been some more contemporary, larger recruitment events. However, in the most contemporary period of time, last couple of years, recruitment has been lower.
Senator Waters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Jay, this kind of follows up on and getting another way what Bob was asking a few moments ago about projections 6 and 7 and the probability of and risk assessment there. Can you offer any further guidance on selecting this 50% number of risk? I mean, can you offer some guidance as to how accurate selecting that number may have been when you're making calculations for other fisheries, or could you in some ways even project backwards into this fishery that if you had made that 50% risk assessment, whether it would have been a good guidance for us? So I'm just wondering how much confidence we can place in that 50% if there's any other way we would know from other times that's been used in other fisheries.
That is a good question. I hesitate to offer a specific example because I'm afraid I'm going to pick the wrong one. So what I'll offer, so this was a big discussion in striped bass recently, and they used it for striped bass. There was a lot of discussion. I may get far afield from your actual question, so I'll okay, thanks.
Senator Waters, allow me, if I could. I had some conversations with staff, and recall our conversations in February where we talked about this do loop between our technical advisors and this board that sets policy. I would submit to the board and to your question that this question of risk is a question of policy. And Jay, I don't want to put words in the TC's mouth, but I think this is one of those things that we have to set and have a very vibrant and full discussion about. What is the appropriate level of risk? What are our management objectives, and how do we want to get to it? So just grant me the chair's prerogative. Just take us back to this room in February. I think it's one of the things that we have before us as we talk about where we go in Menhaden in 2015. So, yes, sir.
If I may follow up on that, I guess that what my takeaway from that would be that I remain kind of skeptical about projection 6 or 7 in lieu of not having had that discussion. Thank you.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to continue on the same vein as the last 3 folks, and the concern is the understandable use of median recruitment. Am I right that that was the only projection that was done? There wasn't a last 3 to 4 years of recruitment and projecting that forward. Is that right? And then I want to follow up.
That's correct. So we made a single choice on how we were going to treat recruitment.
Okay, thanks. And I'm not sure what years were used to calculate median recruitment. It looks like it may be 1960 to 2012. Is that right? So. And again, I'm looking at the stock assessment. I'm not sure I have the right tables, but there's a young of year index. And when I look through that, there's periods in the 70s where that value is in the 1s, 2s, 3s, I think even 4s. And then you get to the last 3 years, and it's 0.23, 0.23, 0.28. And so my concern is with these projections that we're putting an awful lot of faith and hope that recruitment will get 4 to 10 times better, is my sense. At least 4 times better, and then when we project that forward, we can all have, higher stocks and higher yields. So I'm very concerned about that, and of course that's integral to this calculation of risk and 50% probabilities. So you really do have to buy into the going forward, we're going to get much, much better recruitment than we've seen in the last few years.
Mr. Nowalski.
Thank you very much. Projection 7 that contemplates a constant F includes the sentence, note the TAC would change each year. Was that note specific to the values included in the table and suggestive that we would set hard values potentially today for each of the next 3 years, or is the suggestion that the TAC would change based on updated information that the TC would provide us each year in order to keep a constant F, and if so, when would that information be available to the board and the states for usage?
So the projections that we ran were I think in the scenario you're talking about, that was based on what is the TAC that gets us to a probability of having, the highest probability of having F at the target, 50% probability. So that's how those numbers were developed. I think that's a board decision as to the frequency of when we'd be updating and things of that nature. So this is a static projection scenario offered to the board to consider to make their determinations.
Follow up, Adam?
And if the board went in a direction of something more dynamic on an annual basis, what time of year could we expect that information?
So I think you're thinking about we let harvest occur. The way that this would, we wouldn't necessarily, the only thing we could change just in the projection would be what the harvest actually was. And we could rerun that. I don't know how valuable that would be because everything else would be static from 2013. So I think the root of your question is when would you do an assessment update or benchmark or something like that? And I certainly don't think we could pull that off this year. The benchmark for this took a couple of years, so I think you can judge the ability for us to kind of crank on this model again based on that.
Okay. Jay, again, thank you for a very comprehensive presentation. And we're going to move now in. We are still behind time. We're going to go right to Mike for reviewing and setting Menhaden specs for final action. Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to take a quick minute to clarify to the board what's at stake here in terms of working with Amendment 2 to set specifications. And so Amendment 2 allows the flexibility for the board to set a total allowable catch only in 15 or over multiple years. So it could go both ways. It's to the board's decision in 1 year or have the same TAC for multiple years. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is that the board can use the best available scientific information that was presented to them to base that specification decision. So basically all the information that Jay has presented to the board this morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks. Jeff, AP report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The AP met via conference call on April 10th, 2015 to review the results of the benchmark stock assessment and peer review, as well as formulate recommendations for the fishery specification setting process. The list of panel members in attendance is in the report dated April 22nd. There were 2 members of the AP who were not on the call, Ken Hinman from Wild Oceans and Dave Sikorsky from CCA Maryland, both of whom provided comments, written comments to you. Relative to the assessment, the AP members reviewed the results of the benchmark stock assessment and independent peer review. They applauded the stock assessment subcommittee for its hard work in completing a stock assessment that's more comprehensive and passed favorably with the peer review. Generally, the AP commented that the results of the assessment match what they're seeing on the water. An AP member asked what reference points are used to manage other small pelagic fisheries around the world and stated that it appears that the single species reference points as recommended by the peer review are very conservative. Additionally, it was mentioned that stock recruitment conditions seem to be driven by environmental factors as indicated on the fecundity plots. So there was some concern expressed that managing to the reference points may not yield the expected results. If, however, environmental conditions are right, the Menhaden spawning stock biomass should aid in recruitment. It was also discussed by the AP that the new peer-reviewed reference points of F26 MSP threshold and F57 MSP target already equate to ecosystem reference points, since projections are conservative and should ensure that adequate forage remains in the water as estimated by the new assessment through 2 natural mortality estimates that produced age-varying, time-constant values scaled to estimates from the tagging data. This came from one of the graphs that we looked at from the assessment overview that Mike provided. Some AP members stated that the implementation of Amendment 2 and the quota is likely not the cause for the increase in the improved stock status. The change in the assessment data inputs and the models were larger drivers of change in stock status than management since the quota was put in place a couple years ago. An AP member that submitted comments indicated that although the stock is not overfished and overfishing is not occurring based on the new assessment, the role of Menhaden as prey is vitally important and the abundance of younger fish is currently low from recent years of poor recruitment. Further, the need for ecosystem reference points still exists. Relative to the development of the ecosystem reference points, AP members agree that stakeholders, managers, and scientists need to also agree upon the multi-species management approach, and there was some concern that the management process is not currently set up to handle that type of an ecosystem approach. One AP member referenced the Mid-Atlantic Council's ecosystem management guidance document and commented that it suggests keeping it simple by making sure the single species approaches are robust before adding ecosystem complexity. That document was distributed to the AP and the technical committee. An AP member who also submitted comments highlighted the need for an addendum to institute ERPs. Generally, the AP concluded it's interested in being involved in the continued development of ERPs. Relative to the specification recommendations, attending AP members were in favor of multi-year fishery specifications to avoid large swings in the TAC. The AP recommended a 3-year specification, so choosing a TAC that would remain in place through 2017. The AP commented that it's easier to make business plans with a stable TAC for a 3-year time period. The 2015 fishing year is nearly underway, and the industry is awaiting these specifications. AP members commented that this poses significant business challenges when they don't find out about the specifications until May within the fishing year. AP members further commented that the industry would be underfishing relative to the new single species target reference point of F-target 0.38. Also, based on projection results, there's a less than 5% chance of overfishing with all of the TAC levels that range from 170,800 metric tons to 213,500 metric tons. As a result, AP members on the call recommended at least a 213,500 metric ton TAC, which is the 20% denouement plus up. And as a result, AP members on the call would also prefer a TAC level that maintains fishing mortality at the new F target or approaching it, which is preliminarily estimated to result in a higher TAC than 213,500 metric tons. AP members commented that they wanted to see the projections at the target, and they were disappointed that the projections from the new assessment had not yet been made available to the public, making it difficult for the industry to coalesce around a scientifically derived yield from the fishery during the next 3 years. One AP member that submitted comments recommended that keeping the existing catch limits in place, in support of keeping the existing catch limits in place, and instead of adjusting the quota, focus on long-term ecosystem goals. That ends my report. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Jeff, Chairman of AP. Questions for Jeff about the AP report? See none. So here we are on the agenda item, review and set specifications for the fishery. What I'd like to do is take a motion. Dr. Daniel?
Sure, I'll try it. I've given this a lot of thought. I've given staff a copy of this, and Mr. Chairman, if I get a second to this motion, I would like to comment on it further. But my motion would be move that the Commission maintain the coast-wide TAC at 170,800 metric tons for 2015 to promote conservation and initiate Amendment 3 to the Atlantic Menhaden FMP to establish ecological reference points to provide for predators, set a new coast-wide TAC based on these new ecological reference points for implementation in the 2016 fishing season, and review state allocations as required by Amendment 2.
Motion by Dr. Daniel. Is there a second? Second by Representative Peake.
I think.
Lewis, let me ask you a question. Maybe this is a question maybe for Mike. Amendment 3 or addendum? Mike, can you clarify the difference? Or Lewis, do you?
I intend with an allocation discussion it to be an amendment. It would be an amendment. It would be Amendment 3.
Okay, that's the motion that is seconded. What I would like to do, if it pleases the board, is I know there are a number of people in the audience who've come here for this discussion and for this presentation. What I would like to ask our members of the audience is I'd like to take at this point 2 comments in favor of the motion and 2 comments in opposition, and I would like to have them alternate. So what I'd like to do is have someone to speak from the public on behalf of the motion to be followed by someone who is not in favor of the motion. First person I have on the list, Mr. Travelstead, are you in favor or opposed to the motion? In favor. Would you come to the public microphone, please? Actually, Jack, as you're coming up, let me go to Bob Beal, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just quickly, I think, that's a point that may need to be talked about after the public comment is this amendment versus addendum issue. It's going to be, frankly, impossible to get an amendment done to affect allocation in 2016. Through the amendment process, we have to have scoping around the public hearings on scoping, then draft the document, then a second round of public hearings, and we just, given that we're almost halfway through this calendar year, we won't be able to pull that off for 2016. So I think it's a, not to speak in favor or against this motion. It's something that the board's going to have to talk about a little bit. Should these issues be separated or kept in one document through an addendum, or as Dr. Daniel said, allocation is a big deal, so you may want to take the time to go through the amendment process. It's up to the pleasure of the board, but just sort of controlling expectations, 2016 is going to be tough, if not impossible, to pull off through an amendment.
Thank you, Bob. Mr. Travelstead, brief comment in favor of the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to comment on the motion. I am Jack Travelstead, speaking on behalf of the Coastal Conservation Association. The association fully supports the motion. For as long as I can remember, this management board and its various management plans for Menhaden have acknowledged the ecological importance that Menhaden play up and down the Atlantic coast. There have been a number of discussions over the last 30 years about doing something to protect that ecological role. But something has always gotten in the way. Perhaps in the early years, it was the lack of science that prevented the board from doing something. More recently, there seems to be concerns about the status of the stock, and that became a distraction. Today, you have a new benchmark stock assessment before you that, while it doesn't present a stock in perfect health, it presents the best picture that you have seen on Menhaden in decades. And so I'm hoping that you'll view that today as a unique opportunity to once and for all finally move forward in addressing the ecological side of the equation that Menhaden presents. Your own peer reviewers who looked at that benchmark stock assessment encourage you to proceed immediately with the development of ecological reference points. I hope that you do that, but please don't get wrapped around the axle in thinking that in some short period of time you have to come up with a very sophisticated model to address ecological reference points. There is now a lot of science out there, like the Lenfest report, that this board can use to make an informed decision on how to address the ecological side of the equation for Menhaden. And based on a little bit of past experience, I know that this board is capable of doing that over the next year. So we certainly hope that you will pass the motion to finally move forward with ecological reference points. Now, the motion also speaks to maintaining the current coastwide cap, and we support that as well. You've heard the report of the technical committee and the risks associated with changing that cap. You've heard members around the table express concerns about the level of risk and the levels, based on the levels of recruitment that were used to come up with those projections. We share those concerns. But we also think you should maintain the current TAC this year for a very simple, logical reason, and that is changing the harvest level now could ultimately affect the outcome once you have ecological reference points established. It seems you would be putting the cart before the horse if you change harvest this year. We would prefer that you establish the ecological side of the equation first and then let the appropriate harvest levels flow from those ecological reference points. We think that's very logical. We have no objection in the future if harvest goes up, as long as the setting of those harvest levels is tied back to the ecological reference points that you ultimately and hopefully set by this time next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Travelstead. I'd look to a member of the public who would wish to speak in opposition to this motion. I will go down the list. The next person, David Sikorsky. Okay, support. Jake Miles. I'm not sure that I've got the right. I can read very well. In support of? Ken Pinkard? I beg your pardon? Opposition. Please come to the microphone, please, and identify yourself for the board.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. First of all, I'd like to thank you for allowing me the opportunity to address this board and express our concerns. My name is Ken Pinkard, and I'm a third-generation commercial fisherman with Omega Protein in Reedville, Virginia. My father's father and my mother's father both were commercial fishermen. I'm also a member of the United Food and Commercial Workers Union Local 400 headquartered in Landover, Maryland, which represents the employees and the fishermen down in Reedville, Virginia. The commission has had a lot of data before you all in the last year. I mean, I've looked at a lot of it, and I applaud you for being able to be able to get through it and understand and comprehend it, but I need to add the human element to it. I would like to ask, first of all, the yellow shirts, would you notice, you said the visual, I brought them for a reason. I'd like you all to stand. And the reason I'm asking them to stand is because two years ago in 2012, this number here is by design. In 2012, I had 2 busloads come before here, this room, at one time. I'm sure some of you all remember. The number that's standing is how many were laid off after the decision of this board in 2012. And so we accepted that decision because we had to. But we also accepted with the understanding that this commission would take the best available science and revisit this issue. And when the best available science came out in February, it was encouraging to know that the science is there that would allocate us 20% back to put that equal amount of people back to work in 2015, not 2016. And so what my ask is that in consideration, we have a gentleman out there 25 years old, Michael Newton. This is his 2nd year fishing. This is my 31st year fishing. I want his generation to have opportunity to earn a decent living and have benefits. And so if the science was not there, then I couldn't justifiably, I know your decision is not based on a human factor, but I also know there's how this board is consisted of. Every state is being represented, either through the legislature, through governmental appointees, through agencies. There are groups like the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and the CCA, and I respect what they do and how they do it. But there's no one that has more concern about the Chesapeake Bay and this Atlantic coast and these commercial fishermen. That's our livelihood. That's our bread and butter. So we're not going to do anything or overdo anything that we think would hurt us down the road. I think the science has come in. I applaud the technical committee for taking the time and really doing the research. But I also think it's time for us to have our 20% back to put these folks back to work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pinkard. Looking for someone to speak from the public in favor of the motion. I'll go back to the top of the list. Mr. Sikorsky.
Hello, everyone. Mr. Chairman, thank you. Members of the board. My name is David Sikorsky. I am the chairman of the Government Relations Committee for CCA Maryland, also a member of the Sport Fish Advisory Commission in Maryland. And every time I stand still and raise my hand, I get another little title or volunteer position. So I'm here as a volunteer on behalf of CCA, recreational fishermen. The guys from CCA Virginia have also asked me to speak on behalf of them. And I can gladly say a me too to Mr. Travelstead's comments, and then follow up with some of my own that give you a little bit more of a regional perspective. And I think you know that I'd also like to supply a little bit of the human element, the recreational fishermen, because this system that is built around these fisheries management, especially for Menhaden, is managed. We're here trying to manage commercial catch. For the most part, how much harvest we can take and what we leave behind, and a lot of times what gets caught in the mix. And what's really hard for a lot of our recreational fishermen to even wrap their heads around, or even commercial fishermen, folks that sit behind me here, is all these numbers, and we kind of get overwhelmed. So I always gravitate towards that big picture approach because I think it's where most of our fishermen lie. It's where a lot of the frustration lies in the recreational fishing community. You watch the arguments online and wherever else, and that's, the frustration lies is we're big picture people. We don't understand the details. But, in my involvement in fisheries management, I respect the level of detail, the science, and the task in front of this board and the managers. But it really falls to the managers at this point. We have some science, we have some needs, and here in the Chesapeake Bay in this region, the issues with recruitment and abundance are the biggest issues that I think connect directly to our fisheries. This board, or the members here, the ASMFC, has made the decision to decrease decrease mortality of striped bass for a hope to bring back their abundance. And we know that striped bass rely on menhaden for a large part of their diet. But it's not just simply a striped bass versus menhaden relationship. That two species relationship would be no better than a single species model. And so it speaks to the difficulty of even finding a model that can explain the ecosystem. So in general, I think what would solve some of our problem is a big picture approach towards ecosystem-based management, and that's why it's important that I see it in this motion. As I said, menhaden are an important food for striped bass, but they're not the only species. There's species coastwide that rely on them. And because we do have a large abundance, or a large biomass, it is important. It's good that there's more fish out there, but there's not enough yet. We have more fish in the water, and we need to keep those fish. Public comment on this issue was nearly 100% in favor of conservation, of not increasing the limits. That's what this motion does, 100%. And if you attach it back to striped bass, 85% of coastwide public comment was in support of the measures you took on striped bass. So how can you support the striped bass without leaving those menhaden in the water? It's tough to analyze jobs and figure out where the impact is. And I know no one around this table wants to ever put a single person out of work, and it's never the intent of anybody from CCA or any recreational community to try and pick a winner or loser. I fall under the mentality that a rising tide can raise all ships, and I think that's important, especially with this forage species, and we should look at that, think about that as we manage here. And it's, again, why we support conservation and leaving the cap where it is. There's a lot of folks behind me, recreational fishermen, charter fishermen, who where an abundance of menhaden in certain areas really supports their jobs. I did some recent lobbying efforts on the Hill with some folks, and I was lucky enough to join somebody from the was a marine trades representative, and she told me something that really stands out every time I'm on the water, and it's 7 recreational boats equals a job. And so with an abundance of menhaden comes an abundance of predator species and everything else that relates to jobs. So it's just one more piece of that puzzle. 7 boats equals a job. And, as we deal with the whole complexity of trying to build a model, we know menhaden are important. We know they're important different times of the year. Can that natural mortality number in the stock assessment take care of that issue? No, we can't analyze this stuff with a level of certainty. And there's always the unintended consequence. And what species are taking up the slack? The questions that have been in front of this commission for a long time with regard to weak fish, something that must stand out in our heads. Why do we have such issues? Maybe it has something to do with the lack of menhaden abundance. So, ultimately, status quo, which is what this motion recommends, is the most reasonable solution right now. We have an opportunity to take care of everybody's problems, dig into the allocation issues, make it right for the states, and provide for that beneficial economic impact that all local communities throughout this coast really need, and that menhaden have been a major driver of over the years. So again, we have more fish now, and we need to keep those fish there because they can support all. And again, a rising tide can raise all ships. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sikorsky. Looking for a member of the public who wishes to speak in opposition to this motion. The next person I have on the list is Greg D. Dominica. Greg, do you wish to speak in favor? You wish to designate Mr. Landry? Mr. Landry, come forward and identify yourself for the board, please.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Commissioners. Today you have a big decision to make. Before I get into the prepared comments, I would simply just add that I think this particular motion is perhaps best split into two. I need your name, sir. Sorry, my name is Ben Landry with Omega Protein. Sorry. So I would suggest that this motion is perhaps better split into two, one that addresses 2015 harvest levels, and a second motion that would discuss the opportunity that you guys seem to be moving towards, which is initiating an amendment to discuss ecological reference points and future state allocations. But the current stock assessment that you guys have at your disposal is perhaps the most comprehensive and well-developed stock assessment that Menhaden has ever seen. I think it provided a snapshot at the population that you certainly did not have in 2012, when uncertainty was not a barrier to enacting regulations. Now that you have that certainty, it seems like the pumping of the brakes is the course that you guys may be moving towards, and I would suggest that's perhaps not the best course of fisheries management. As according to the Menhaden TC, as putting the new target fishing mortality rate at 0.38, which equates to that 57% MSP. This is a target that Omega Protein supports, and was actually quite higher than what you guys did just 2 years ago. If you look at the fishing mortality rate in the terminal year of 0.22, which is even far lower than the new target F, and has been at a fishing mortality level for quite some time, I don't think that you see, especially on Omega Protein's part, an expansion of this fishery. Fishing mortality rates have been relatively low, and there's virtually no fear of getting back up to previous levels from 1970s, 1980s that I think a lot of you guys fear. With the realized fishing mortality rate in 2013 at 70%, that is even lower than this Pew Linfest suggested F that seems to be discussed quite a bit. So, I mean, these are the things that we're talking about, of fishing to a target and current target levels. They're extraordinarily conservative, perhaps more conservative than any fishery in the United States, as it relates to the science at hand. So these are the decisions that you have to make. Do you want to, in some ways this word may seem a little harsh, but do you want to ignore the TC's hard work over the last 18 months? Do you want to ignore the peer-reviewed stock assessment and say that we know best of what to do with ecological reference points? So those are the things that we wanted to bring out. We would support material increases in the harvest quota. We think that the science at hand has proven that the stock can support it. Ecological reference points are the goals that we support, but we also don't want to see Menhaden be the guinea pig for ecological reference points where they're rushed and incomplete and applied to this fishery. Let's do it. Let's do it right, but let's not do something because of a public cry or a philosophy that we need these ecological reference points. Let's get it done. You'll have Omega Protein at all those meetings standing shoulder to shoulder with you to develop the best ecological reference points. As I can go through Jason's report that doesn't identify the spawner stock recruit relationship. So essentially at that point, how many eggs do you truly need in the population in order to be successful? So this may not be the best public comments you've ever heard at any of these management meetings, but it's from the heart. Omega Protein is responsible, a sustainable harvester of Menhaden, and to be zeroed out in any quota increase after this assessment is a slap in the face to the 100 years of responsible fishing practice that that we've engaged in. So I thank you for your time and wish you the best luck.
Thank you, Mr. Landry. I'd indicated to the board or the public an opportunity for two individuals to speak on either side of the motion. My question to the public, now going back to the favorable side, we have heard from two folks. Are there any comments from the public that would differ substantially from what you've heard that would like to address the board? Yes, sir. Come forward and identify yourself, please. In favor of the motion?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Patrick Paquette, Government Affairs Officer of the Massachusetts Striped Bass Association, and I'm also a recreational advocate who works with groups from Maine to North Carolina. Speaking very specifically as a charter boat owner, tackle manufacturer, and fisherman from Massachusetts, I just want to point out that although I agree this assessment shows a lot of fish in the water, this assessment also shows a significant lack of abundance in New England waters. North of Rhode Island, the assessment scientist actually left out the trawl survey data, the two trawl surveys, the one from Massachusetts and the one from Maine, because of, and I'm going to quote the assessment now, because of a lack of interaction with Menhaden. Your actions have helped Menhaden begin to recover, but we don't have them yet where I live. I want what they're seeing in New York. I want what New Jersey has, because I've had it in the past in my lifetime. I'm not talking about ancient times. In my lifetime, we had robust amounts of Menhaden in Gloucester Harbor and in Boston Harbor, and it drove unbelievable fisheries. And we want our striped bass to come in from Stellwagen Bank in federal waters and to be in near shore. And that message I want you to hear. This motion will let you use your fish wisely. It will let you raise a quota responsibly and based on data that considers the whole coast. Not just one rush being pushed by one company out of one state that has shown record profits for each of the last 5 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paquette. Again, another alternative perspective in those wishing to speak in opposition to the motion that differs substantially from the comments that you have heard before. Anyone? Yes, sir. This gentleman in the hat. You please come forward and identify yourself for the board, please. Could you put your mic?
Sorry about that. Good morning. My name is James Stansel, and I'm a union representative for the commercial fishermen that you see. And basically, I have a few questions. Number one is, we're observing egg counts, but how are we studying the egg counts? Are we sending divers down to study the eggs? I mean, how are we determining the numbers when we say egg count? Because I think this plays a big role in this question. I think everybody's looking at, we're saying, okay, we see so many fish, but how are we determining our egg counts? No answers. Okay. All right, let me move forward. Because we've had a reduction, if you look at the charts that have been presented, because we've had a reduction in the number of fishermen, period, we've lost a lot of your bait fishermen over the years. You only have one reduction plant left on the East Coast now, whereas I think 30 years ago, according to the chart, you had almost 10 to 15 reduction plants. So you were fishing millions of more pounds of fish. And then that doesn't even look at the bait fishermen that might have closed last year due to the reductions that you put in. Then you also have to look at some states are fishing less fish. So why don't we increase the proportions that the reductions can fish or others can fish, since others are not fishing as much? I think, if we observe this realistically and look at our charts, the years have shown that we've had fluctuations where the fish are up or down. Now, has anyone pointed out whether this is ecological, or is it from pollution, or is it from overfishing? It can't be from overfishing, because you've had a reduction in the number of fishermen over the 30-year period. So you are taking less fish out of the water. All right? Now, how many bait fishermen closed this year? We know we only have one reduction plant. Yes, bycatch is a big problem. How do we measure bycatch with so many fishermen out here fishing such a variety of fish? We want to say 6,000 pounds of bycatch, but is there any way we can improve the nets so that the Menhaden can swim out of the nets? Has anyone studied that? I mean, there are a lot of questions I have. I've been left with a lot of questions this morning, and my number one question is, how are we studying the egg count? You know what I mean? I'm not saying that you don't have an accurate measurement system, but are we sending divers down? Because other than that, I don't see how you're going to measure the eggs. You know what I mean? Being realistic. And I close with those points.
Thank you. The board, we have a motion on the floor. Discussion, Dr. Daniel.
Wanted to just provide some of the justification for this. And, you know, this goes back to the 2012 meeting, Mr. Chairman, and my role as the chair of the board at that time. And, you know, this continues to bring out more people than any other issue that we're dealing with. It's an important issue to this commission. It's probably the backbone of our coastal fisheries along the east coast of the United States. And there's uncertainty in where we are right now. We heard it from the technical committee report. And we've had numerous occasions where we have had a stock assessment. We were very concerned about the status of the stock. We got a new stock assessment that says everything's great. How confident are we in that? I'm pretty confident, but I think we need to take the time to do this right. And based on discussions that I've had as the chairman with staff and with other commissioners around the table, you know, there's a lot of concerns. New York, being able to account for their fish, the overages that occur on 0.1% of the allocation. Those types of things need to be corrected. We don't need to be spending as much time managing this fishery as we are if we do it right. I think this takes us in that direction. I think we've got a good harvest opportunity. I know it's critically important to the recreational fishery, the for-hire sector, certainly omega protein, but also to our bait fisheries. And Menhaden is the backbone of many of our biggest fisheries in the mid-Atlantic, the crab fishery. You know, not to mention what's going on in New England with the lobsters. And now that New England's competing with us for bait, it's creating an issue. So we have to look at this thing from a parity standpoint and do our best to make sure that we have adequate forage out there for the fish that we're trying to manage. And everybody says striped bass. I say cobia. I say king mackerel. I say bluefin tuna. I say a lot of the fisheries from the South Atlantic's perspective that really aren't even mentioned in the mix. And as far as biological reference points, I go for the most parsimonious option that we can come up with. And I think that's something that we can direct the technical committee to do. I think we can have a work group put together to help, you know, work on these issues. But I don't necessarily disagree. 57% SPR is a pretty lofty goal. That's a pretty defensible reference point from my perspective. Is that the appropriate biological reference point for Menhaden? That'll be something for the board to decide as we move forward. But I think something this big, we need to take the time. I feel like we're continuing to go down a rabbit hole. We need to turn around, come out of it, and head in this direction. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further discussion. Mr. Nowalski.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the turnout from the public here today on both sides of the issue, and I also want to express my gratitude to the assemblyman that I represent here today. He has taken great opportunity to interact with both sides of the issue, recreational and commercial fishing interests in my home state, and I can speak here today confidently on his behalf. And to that end, Mr. Chairman, I am prepared to offer a substitute motion. That substitute motion, I think, has to incorporate the results of the stock assessment that we have here before us. I think that if that stock assessment had come back and was painting a picture of Atlantic Menhaden in a more discouraging manner than what we've seen, I don't think there would be any opposition from this table today. So, to that end, I move that the Commission set the 2015 TAC at 187,880 metric tons and initiate Amendment 3 to the Atlantic Menhaden FMP to establish ecological reference points and review state allocations as required by Amendment 2. The TAC would increase by 10% in 2016 and 2017, or until a new coastwide TAC could be set based on the ecological reference points developed in Amendment 3.
Thank you, Mr. Nowalski. Is there a second? Second from Mr. Train. So we have a substitute motion. Give us just a moment to get that on the board, and I got hands going up. So far, let me tell you who I've got on my list. Mr. Gilmore, Senator Waters, Mr. O'Reilly, Mr. Millard, Dr. Millard, excuse me, Representative Peake, Mr. Adler, Ms. Fegley, Mr. Stockwell, Mr. Grout, and Mr. Goldsboro. Just a moment. Dave, you had a question?
Yeah, just while it's being typed up, I'm to be clear on the motion. So it's 187,000 tons in 15. It goes up 10% from there in 16 and up again in 17 by another 10%. I just want to be clear.
Correct, or until a new TAC could be set based on the reference points, based on biological reference points. And that 187,880 represents 10% for 2015.
Adam, is that your motion on the board? Can you confirm, read that into the record, please, for us? Make sure we've got it.
I believe so. Ms. Kearns has what I had typed up originally, but that looks correct. I will read it again. Move to substitute the TAC at 187,880 metric tons for 2015 and initiate Amendment 3 to the Atlantic Menhaden FMP to establish ecological reference points and to review state allocations as required by Amendment 2. The TAC would increase by 10% in 2016 and 2017, or until a new coastwide TAC could be set based on ecological reference points developed by Amendment 3.
That motion was by Mr. Nowalski, seconded by Mr. Train. Discussion on the...
Point of order. Mr. Chairman, a point of order, if I may.
Yes, Dr. Simpson, Dr. Pierce.
Yeah, I think, I believe Mike said during at the beginning of this meeting that we were, because of the amendment that's in place right now, obliged to keep the TAC constant. Just a clarification, because I thought that's what Mike said, just to make sure we're not going down a rabbit hole here if the motion is out of order.
Yeah, just specify that the board could set a TAC for 2015 or a TAC over multiple years. The TAC does not need to be the same if it's set over multiple years. There's nothing in the plan that specifies that restriction.
So, thank you, Dr. Pierce. The motion is in order. Excuse me, the substitute motion is in order. Discussion on the substitute motion. I had Mr. Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is a question really for Mike. So neither one of these motions does anything actually for this year on the bait fishery issue, the allocation into that. So the question is, we would then have to live on transfers for this year under the bait fishery. And assuming that, do you have numbers on what the overage was coastwide? And so the bottom line of the question is, are we going to have enough fish to cover the overages while we sort all this out? Thank you.
The answer to the first part is it takes a management document to address allocation, either an addendum or an amendment. Amendment 2 specifies we will revisit allocation in 16. The answer to your second part of the question is it depends on how states scale up their fisheries to meet this new TAC. And so if you scale up proportionally, then you will likely have similar overages. If states keep their fisheries similar to what we've been harvesting at, then this increase would cover that. But I would suspect that the states will increase their harvest relative to the increase in the TAC.
Senator Waters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, obviously I speak from a state which doesn't have a large interest in this fishery, so I think it's important to step back and see what kind of interests we are trying to accommodate here. I think we do have technical reports that justify some increase in the TAC. I think also, as I've noted earlier, we have uncertainty about risks and probabilities as well. I also think that whatever we do may want to think about how much of any increase we're going to give to industry and how much might be allocated to the states that might be given back for conservation purposes. So as to the point of this particular amendment, I think it does make sense to initiate an increase to 187,000. I was personally thinking of 192,000 because going back to that projection 4 of the earlier report, but I have concerns about building in the increases in the second 2 years without having had the discussion of allocation or having some better figures on the risks involved. So I think for my fellow commissioners that perhaps the first part of this amendment makes the most sense in terms of what we know, but the second parts of it perhaps get us into territory that's more uncertain. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll keep comments to the substitute motion. I can support the substitute motion. I, too, was looking to see someone talk about 192,150 metric tons, which corresponds to a 10% change from where we were in 2012. I do have a couple of comments about this. I like the approach from a conservation benefit. I was an ecology major, so I have great appreciation for ecosystem-based reference points, ecosystem-assisted management, all the things that we've talked about over the years. So I do think we can move in that direction. There's been a lot of work lately, both at the council level and at the ASMFC, on forage fish and ecological reference points. It's not the impossibility that it may have been several years ago. However, it won't happen overnight. And when it happens, there's going to be modifications. So let's realize that as we go forward, that it can be done, but there will always be modifications. I did want to mention that up until 2012, one of the benefits of Amendment 2 was it shows us just which states have a situation with bait that we didn't know about before, whether it be reporting, unknown harvesters, whatever the situation was. I contend that can be taken care of no matter what our management framework looks like going forward. The idea is that we now know there's more interest in bait than before. Virginia does have 3 different sectors, not just one. It has a vibrant non-pursane fishery as well as a snapper rig fishery as well as omega. There are 3 different sectors. So I think as we go forward, this is in keeping with conservation. Conservation includes man. So let's really vouch for conservation. Let's also vouch for the ASMFC, which prides itself on sustainable fisheries and prides itself on sound science. And all of that has been demonstrated through this assessment, benchmark assessment, and peer review process. If you go back just a little bit, and this will be the last part of my thoughts, to 2011, we started on this process with an idea that we really need to get the Menhaden stock below the threshold. It was as simple as that. Let us get it below the threshold. That took wings and we flew towards the target. We debated what that meant to go towards the target or to the target for a while. We did that. We took the best science possible that we had at the time, which was through 2009. Once we had that, we did go together through a process. Some didn't agree with that process, but we had a process. We then went through an update. The update didn't fare so well. There were problems with the update. Nonetheless, the ASMFC did say we need to pay attention to what we learned from the last assessment. Now we have this assessment. This assessment is something that really, I agree with those who commented, is strong and is sound, and I think that we need to pay attention to where we are on the reference points. They are formidable, I think, as far as a threshold and target value, both for fishing mortality rate and for the eggs. So those are my comments. I appreciate it, and I will support the motion.
Thank you, Rob. Just for the board's understanding, the new base, I think, Adam, and check me on this, Mr. Nowalski, the 2015 TAC under these calculations, 187,880 metric tons, which is a 10% increase over where we are now. A 10% increase, as you contemplate in 2016, would be 206,670 metric tons, which is a 10% over the 10% in 2015. And subsequent to that, 2017 TAC would be 227,335 metric tons. So just to be sure that the board is clear on what those numbers look like. From there, we'll go to Mike Millard. Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service cannot support the substitute amendment for a couple reasons. I was struck by several statements during the TC report, mostly having to do with the variability in the analysis. I heard the statement that the reference points would vary around the target in a distributional way, and that seemed to be fairly innocuous. Of course, the question is, what does that distribution look like? And then I listened to some very insightful questions from David Pierce and David Simpson poking at that uncertainty. And when you start to add these things together and you realize that these uncertainties compound in an exponential way, not even in an additive way, I start to feel less good about some of the projections that I see in the TC report. So for risk management alone, the service can't support an increased TAC. Secondly, I think Jack Travelstead had it just right, saying we should let the ERPs come to the table first and then let the new tax flow from the ERPs. Thank you.
Representative Peake.
Thank you. I speak in opposition to the substitute motion, and I hope that it's defeated for several reasons. One, I think that it fails to account for the fact that we're not seeing any of these fish north of Rhode Island, as one of the members of the public spoke to earlier today. Secondly, I think we worked very hard to get at the target, and by increasing the TAC as is proposed in this substitute motion, for lack of a better characterization, I think we're throwing caution to the wind. We have a very, I think, startling table in the materials that were presented to us today, and by increasing the TAC to 187,880, while that number isn't specifically in there, I think that the percent chance of missing the target would be somewhere in excess of 60%, which in my mind is unacceptably high. Lastly, in closing, because I'm losing my voice, as you can hear, I will associate myself with the comments of Dr. Daniel that I thought were spot on with the underlying motion, and it's for those reasons I hope this is defeated and we can get on to talking about the underlying motion. Thank you.
Mr. Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's funny how we take away and we have trouble trying to give anything back. It's not overfished. Overfishing's not occurring. I do support the ecological reference point part of either one of these motions, and I also wonder, as I've questioned before, how many fish are out, not the eggs, how many fish are out there versus how many are harvested, and it seems that there's plenty left for forage. One of my questions had to do with, and I think Chairman brought this up, that if this new number is put in, does pass, that the following year there'll be another increase and another increase. And this falls back to what I had said in a previous discussion on page 5 of the technical committee. I asked if the current TAC that we have now and has been proposed for this coming year stays where it is. This table 7 showed that in the following year there'd be an automatic increase, and then in 2017 there'd be another increase. And is that a correct assessment? Because you said if you put a new number in, then it goes up every year by a certain percentage. So on page 5, table 7 of the previous document, is it true that if it stays at the current level, which is like 170,800 metric tons, that the following year it will go up, and then the following year it will automatically go up again? Is that what I'm reading here?
Yes, sir. That's my take on the motion on the floor, the substitute motion on the floor. Yes.
No, not that. I mean, yes, that would happen with that number. But on this table 7, it says it basically says that the number we have now in existence, which is 170,800, which has also been proposed in the regular motion, does that mean that the following year it will, in 2016, automatically go up, and then in 2017 go up again? Just like you just said it would happen with this one. Would it happen with the other one too?
Bill, with that specific approach, that's the constant F approach. So to maintain a 50% probability of achieving F target, in each of the 3 years, the TAC is going to change. And as a result, it does go up in each of the 3 years for projection run number 7, the one you're referencing. I think what Mr. Nowalski has done is a little bit of a combination of the two, used the TACs that were referenced in the other projection runs to combine a changing TAC through time as opposed to projection run 7 that was presented by the technical committee.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, well, basically what I'm trying to say is it looks like if you keep the 170,800, which has been proposed in one of the motions, okay, it gives you a number. And then with using the same level, it does go up the next 2 years. And in this motion, whatever that number is, 187, whatever, that would go up automatically, as you said, the following year. So it looks like there'll be an increase in the TAC, even if you stay the same at the 170, there'd still be an increase in 2016 and 2017. At least that's the way I'm reading it.
Ms. Fegley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will have comments on the main motion as well, but I cannot support this motion as written. First of all, I think the board would be wise to considering the TAC separately from the other two issues of the ERPs and the allocation. I believe we can set the TAC without an amendment process. The other issues are bigger, and as Dr. Daniel said, require some time to get them right. So the bottom line on this motion, which I hope will be defeated, is that while I could support a number of 187,880, the subsequent increases of 10% each year seem counter to everything that we have accomplished over the last few years, especially given the risk in those projections and the idea that we're banking on that recruitment that median recruitment. So bottom line, like I said, I'll have comments. I hope we get back to the main motion, but I cannot support this one.
Mr. Stockwell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given the updated status of stock and for most of the rationale that Adam offered during his move to the motion to substitute, I can support the motion to substitute with the exception of the hardwired in addition of the 10% in the TAC increase in 2016 and 2017. So I'm going to make a motion to amend.
Mr. Stockwell, would you hold that? Y'all can certainly overrule me, but I would call that out of order. I think we're going to get ourselves wrapped out around the axle. So y'all can certainly vote to overrule me, but I would have that motion out of order.
Point of order.
Point of order.
Why is it out of order? You're allowed to make up to 2 amendments on the substitute motion. You also should be going back and talking about the underlying motion too in this debate under Robert's Rules of Order, but it certainly is within Robert's Rules of Order to make an amendment to the substitute.
Okay, did I hear an amendment or did I hear a substitute?
You heard an amendment. And if I'm allowed to make the motion to amend,
proceed.
I would, if you could put the motion back up on the board, what I want to do is delete the last sentence, that the TAC would increase by 10% through ecological reference points, so that we would only be substituting the 187,880 for 2015 and initiating the amendment.
Motion to amend by Mr. Stockwell. Is there a second? Second by Senator Waters. Everybody know where we are? Okay. Now the motion to amend is the motion on the floor. That motion is to move to amend the substitute motion by removing the TAC at 187,880 metric tons for 2015. Un momento. Mr. Goldsboro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was prepared to comment on the earlier motion, but the sentiment is still the same. I prefer the initial motion, the original motion from Dr. Daniel. I have to say that I heard shortly ago a comment that with respect to quota that it's often taken but rarely returned, something to that respect. I think that is actually a sentiment that we can say about the ecosystem pretty consistently over time. That forage, Menhaden specifically, which I think is essentially the fuel of the food web, is taken but not returned through our management actions. Reference has been made to how good the picture is painted by this assessment. Overfishing is not occurring, the stock is not overfished, and that's true. But if you, and I would say that, particularly with respect to biomass, things are better than the last benchmark, but I do think it's important for us all to be cognizant of the fact that with respect to abundance, which is most important for forage, we actually have a more dire picture than the last benchmark. The abundance level is lower than the last benchmark. And so let's temper our comments about the good news and therefore let's cash in on it, and let's think more in terms of allowing whatever improvement we might have in the stock to fuel the food web that's been waiting a long time. We also last year had a benchmark assessment for striped bass that the result was there's no overfishing and the stock's not overfished, but we proceeded to cut back on the catch by 25%. So there is a lot more to an assessment than just those 30,000 foot conclusions. We do have a lot of
very obvious ecological imbalances still in the food web on this coast. We know that striped bass in Chesapeake Bay are suffering a higher mortality rate due to a disease that's been linked to poor nutrition. We've heard that, well, they can shift to other prey. Well, they have shifted to other prey. They've eaten juvenile blue crabs, which is a very valuable fishery in Chesapeake Bay. I understand they're doing the same with juvenile lobster further north, another valuable fishery. They also have shifted to bay anchovies. Some might say, well, they're very abundant. Much smaller piece of nutrition for something as big as a striped bass. A lot more work to obtain it, too. But that puts them in competition with other predators that depend on bay anchovies. For example, the weakfish that we know is at such a low level, we pretty much have thrown up our hands about what we can do about it. Striped bass outcompete weakfish for their primary forage. Not only that, we now are told that striped bass are feeding on juvenile weakfish for lack of their preferred prey. So when we talk about giving back, we talk about that from a responsible management standpoint. I think at this juncture, to what extent we might have a positive turn in the Menhaden stock, we would do well to give back to the ecosystem and implement the sentiment of the initial motion and move forward with more responsible management. Thank you.
All right, just to remind the board where we are. We have now at the top of the screen a substitute motion which was offered by Mr. Nowalski and seconded by Mr. Train. Now a motion on the floor to amend that substitute motion. Thank you, Mr. Grout. The motion would be to move to amend the substitute motion by removing, quote, the TAC would increase by 10% in 2016 and 2017, or until a new coastwide TAC could be set based on ecological reference points developed by Amendment 3. That motion to amend was made by Mr. Sockwell and seconded by Senator Waters. Further discussion on the floor. Mr. Grout.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the amendment and to the substitute. When we were addressing Amendment 2, we were basing it on a updated stock assessment that was very uncertain compared to previous stock assessments. In fact, I remember asking, they said that we were overfishing. I said, well, what do we need to reduce our harvest by to get to a non-overfishing status, and the technical committee could not give us that number. So they said that 20% would get us in the right direction. We now move forward to an assessment that we recently had that is a new assessment, a new benchmark assessment that was peer-reviewed and showed a very different picture than what we had from the last update, and also more similar to what we'd had in the past. As I look at this, we set that 20% based on, I won't call it a guess, we were doing our best, but we were trying to reduce mortality because we thought we were overfishing. We clearly now see that we haven't been overfishing for the past 10 years. For the past 30 years. And in fact, we've been below the target for the past 10 years. I feel comfortable with allowing this modest increase, and even with this modest increase, we will still be leaving fish in the water for our prey species that we are managing right now, because the fishing mortality rate is less than 2/3 of the target, not 2/3 of the threshold, but 2/3 of our target. A target is typically something you want to be fishing, trying to attain, or being close to it, and not something like a threshold where you don't want to be anywhere near, you want to stay away from that line. So I think this gets at giving a modest increase based on the newest stock assessment, and it also moves us down the road of one of my favorite issues that I've been trying to get this board to work on for 5 or 6 years, and that's trying to establish ecologically based reference points. as well as look at potentially reallocation and amendment. I think this is the right way for the board to go, and on a personal note, New Hampshire will appreciate the 11-pound increase in quota that this will give us.
Dr. Hasbrook.
Thank you. I had my hand up before because I was prepared to offer an amendment. So I don't want to complicate things right now, and it's probably out of order, but if you could come back to me once we've had the vote on this amendment, I have an amendment to offer as well.
Dr. Pierce.
I could support the motion to amend the substitute because it gets rid of the 10% increase in 2013 and 17. Those increases, to me, don't make much sense in light of all the discussion that we've heard so far. However, if it does pass, then I would support it. I would not then support it as a substitute motion because the substitute motion then is 187,880 metric tons. And although it is a relatively modest increase from where we are right now, I'll just restate what I said before, and that is we do have a new assessment, an updated assessment. It was peer-reviewed, and we're very thankful for it. Nevertheless, as stated this morning, there are highly uncertain projections. Recruitment in recent years really hasn't been accounted for. That is that lower recruitment. I look at the percent risk of exceeding the F target. We're at the F target. That's where we need to be. That's where I would like to say. So I'll reiterate the point made by Representative Peake. If we go with 187,880 metric tons, the percent risk of exceeding the F target would be around 60% or so. And frankly, I'm uncomfortable with 50%, which is the coin toss. So at 60%, hard to live with that, hard to defend that. So again, it's a modest increase, but I'm influenced by other factors, those I've just mentioned.
Mr. Fode.
It's always interesting when we get in discussion about Menhaden. I've been doing it for a long time, and as we go for the years, it always kind of concerned me that we always look at saying this is a great stock assessment when we look at that it is not fully within the range. If we talk about any other species, we talk about how it expands to the range, like black sea bass is now up in New Hampshire and Maine and other species like that. We don't usually have a species where we say, well, it's sustainable at one of the lowest levels in historical time and missing from whole areas where historically it's been. So that's always been my concern with the way we manage Menhaden. So that hasn't changed. I also look at that one entity shouldn't have 85.7% of the resource. That's one entity, one company. That we don't allow that to happen in any other species that I know. And the only time that happened was when we did IFQs on surf clams and caused a disaster that I've seen over the years. So it really disturbs me when we look at this, and it also puts me perplexed of what I'm supposed to do here, and look at what I'm aiming at. And that's, I think, a decision that a lot of us are having around the table. What are we supposed to do? My motion, if I had made one, was that basically that any increase would come out of reallocation and basically put it from the one entity over to the rest of the other states and basically handle it that way, not by a general increase. And that's where I had supported. So the original motion that Adam made, I could not support going forward. And I'm still having problems with this motion. And I'll have to make that decision when we come to a vote. But it really concerns me that we set the premise that we hear all this thing, how great the resource is. When I first got here, some of you remember Tony Vega was the governor's appointee. He was a purse seiner from Massachusetts. Then he became a legislator. And then he sent Vito Calamar. And Vito's job was a purse seiner from Massachusetts who basically harvest Menhaden. Well, there ain't no purse seiners in Massachusetts harvesting Menhaden that I know of like they were back then. And there's none down in, up in Maine that basically do it like they did when the reduction plants were up there. So that's my concern. That's when I have to come to it. And I would assume in some ways go to the first motion because we basically would have done the ecological concerns and we basically would have done the reallocation. And I think we need to do that first.
Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the amendment to the substitute motion. I think we need to be consistent. When it came to striped bass, we were falling all over ourselves to accept the new reference points and reduce the harvest there. We've had a very good assessment just completed for Menhaden, and I think based on what we've seen there, we're not overfishing. It's not overfished. I think we can withstand this small increase in the TAC. And I would also like to emphasize the socioeconomics of this. I've seen in our state the lack of availability of bait in our blue crab fishery, and the subsequent increase in price has hurt a lot of our crabbers, and I know that's a problem up and down the coast. So for those reasons, I do support this amendment.
Mr. Borden.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Conceptually, I can support 10% increase. I think it makes sense at this stage, but I have reservations, and my reservations get to some of the points that I raised the first time I spoke. I put together a list of what I would characterize 8 major flaws in the Menhaden plan, and these aren't just Rhode Island issues; they're issues that kind of permeate the FMP, and I'm extremely troubled by the prospect that we would do an amendment, and it's going to take, if we get into any of those problems that I have on my list, it's going to take at least 2 years, if not longer, to do this. And so what troubles me the most is we have these inequities that are built into the system, and those are going to continue for 2 years. So, I mean, to me, if we're going to increase the quota by whatever the number is, 37 million pounds, I think we need to do something else and have basically some kind of bridging strategy, for lack of a better word, that allows the states and together to kind of collaborate and work together to try to solve some of these issues and maybe redistribute through voluntary actions some of the quota to try to get away from the situation where the state of New Hampshire has to manage 117-pound quota. Thank you.
Mr. Ballou.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I just want to note my appreciation for the significant public input that's been provided on this issue, both before this meeting and at this meeting. Very, very much appreciated and very compelling on both sides. Secondly, I want to note that I would support the amendment to the substitute, but not the substitute itself, because of my concern that the increase is higher than that which can be supported based on our risk tolerance. And my sense is that, I should say my understanding is that 187,000 pound quota would there would be more than a 50% probability of exceeding the target F in 2015. And my comfort level would be perhaps a modest increase, and I think 173,000 is what I see from the technical committee report, such that it would maintain that 50% probability in 2015. The essence of my comments are very similar to the sentiments expressed by Representative Peake and Dr. Pierce, so I won't reiterate those. And that's all I have to say at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ballou. Yes, that is reflected in Table 2 of the memo from staff to the board on recommended BRPs and projection runs. So what you do, Mike just pointed out to me, is that you're somewhere between the second and third row in 2015, 2016, and 2017. Mr. Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting the entire state of Rhode Island weigh in on this, our 66,000 pounds that were allowed, so I appreciate that a lot. I can't support the first motion, the original motion, because management is now driven by science. I've been killed by science on a lot of other fisheries besides Menhaden. I'd be much more willing to support the second motion with the addendum, because then perhaps maybe I'm only wounded by science. Certainly 1 year would be a nice, easy step back into this fishery. Also, I would prefer to have a mechanism, like David alluded to, that a state like Rhode Island and some other states could get access to this fishery in a much more expedited fashion than an amendment. Whatever that bridge motion is, whatever that bridge mechanism is, I would appreciate, but at this point can't accept the first motion. I would accept the second motion if it could be amended to accommodate a much more expedited access to that resource for Menhaden poor states like Rhode Island. Thank you.
Mr. O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we have a question first, which is the motion doesn't say anything about 2016 and 17 now with the amendment. Is it implied that the 187,880 metric tons would be a continuum through 2016 and 17 unless changed? I think that needs to be clarified. Then I'll have some comments if I can get an answer to that.
Mr. Stockwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had not intended it to be anything more than a 2015 TAC pending the work of the board.
Okay, just for the board's understanding, and Tony, Bob, Mike, I'm going to look to you. An amendment will likely be back here, not ready for final action. It's probably going to be a 2-year deal. Is that correct, Bob?
Well, you know, as with all addendums or amendments, it depends on how many issues you guys want to tackle on that and how complicated they get. But the reality is an amendment will not affect 2016. The best you can do would be to have an amendment in place that will affect 2017 and beyond.
So, Rob, that's the working assumption. To answer that question, now back to your discussion.
Tell me the assumption on the number of years that it would be 187,880 metric tons, please. Is it just 2015? There were two different thoughts there.
Terry?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, given Bob's advice about the length of time it will take this board to work through an amendment, should this motion or the underlying motion pass, I would like to wordsmith by adding in 2016 as well. So it would be a two-year time period.
Terry, that's an amendment.
I won't do it. I won't amend the amendment. So we'll just let it lie.
Rob.
I think given the timing involved that we really should ask the motioner and the seconder if they could have a friendly amendment, because the practicalities seem that it's going to be more than 2015, and to get back on track for 2016 might be a real challenge. So I don't know that this disrupts Robert's rules to do a friendly amendment.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate what you're trying to do. The amendment on the floor belongs to the body. I would rule a motion out of order.
I'm feeling friendly, though.
I wore my happy fish tie today, Terry. I'm not real happy right now. Rob.
Well, we could support the motion, but it would be making sure that we can come back for 2016, which I guess will be a challenge. The original substitute was our preference, but I do take the other comments that were made to be some indication of resistance there, and I think there will be an update in 3 years is what I understand, so we really will get a test on the strength, the true strength of this last assessment. So we could support the motion, but may come back with something else in just a minute.
Let me ask the body. Is the body willing to entertain a friendly emotion? Is there an objection to a friendly amendment that would apply Mr. Stockwell's motion to 2016? as well. Is there any objection from the board? I see none. So we will make that note. Can we put that on the board, please? Bob?
So just so we know as staff what you want us to include here, it will say, and by adding the 2016 quota will be set at 187,880. Is that right, Terry? All right, we'll get that in there, and then you guys can make sure it's what you have in mind.
Dr. Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before we vote on this amendment, and to help address one of the issues that Dave Borden and Tom Foti and Eric Reed brought up, as I mentioned to you before, I was prepared to make an amendment. Without yet making that amendment, the intent would be to start to address the state-by-state allocation through an addendum. But I'll hold off on making that amendment until the time is appropriate.
Thank you, Dr. Hasbrook. Hear from the board who's not spoken, anyone who's not spoken, who I've not called on about this motion. Ms. Fegley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I would, at this point, beseech us to think carefully about where we're going with this. I think that the modest increase by the science is supportable. It would lock us into a coast-wide TAC that is among the lower levels of harvest in the time series. We know we're fishing below a target level of F57%. So that seems reasonable. However, we also have, and we can do that without an amendment. As I understand, we could make that decision just as a specification. But we've included it with an amendment that is going to tackle two very complicated issues, ERPs and allocation. Amendment 2 is probably one of the most important things that's happened in fisheries management in many years. That being said, Amendment 2 left us with a tangled mess. We have really big problems. I am not convinced that an amendment process is going to allow us to logically address and fix the problems we have when we're dealing with these very complicated issues. I think we need to take a step back, set our TAC, lock us in. Then I think it would be really smart to put managers together, board members, where the rubber hits the road, and come up with viable options for ERPs and this state-by-state allocation mess, and bring it back to the board in August or at the annual meeting. We lose 5 months. If we can't get it done, we'll start an amendment. But I have grave concerns that, by starting the amendment process, we all know how the amendment process works. We're in it right now. We have substitutes, amendments. We wind up with unintended consequences. These are problems too complicated to get sorted out in parliamentary procedure. So that's, I guess the bottom line is, while I would support the level of TAC, the amendment process worries me, and if there's any way we could split the motion, that would be great. Thank you.
Who's ready to vote? We'll call the question, take a moment to caucus. If I could have the board members take your seats, please. Red.
Dave just said that Bob said that we couldn't change the state by state. It's an addendum.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for that brief hiatus. Give us time to caucus. Let me, as Joe suggests, let me read the motion so it is clear what the board is voting on. This is the motion to amend the substitute motion, and that motion is move to amend the substitute motion by removing, quote, the TAC would increase by 10% in 2016 and 2017, or until a new coastwide TAC could be based on ecological reference points developed by Amendment 3, end quote, and adding, quote, and 2016, end quote, to set TAC at 187,880 metric tons. That motion is by Mr. Stockwell and seconded by Mr. Waters. A roll call vote has been requested and so ordered.
Maine.
Yes.
New Hampshire.
Yes.
Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
No.
Rhode Island.
No.
Connecticut.
Yes.
New York.
Yes.
New Jersey.
Yes.
Delaware.
Yes.
Maryland.
Yes.
Potomac River Fisheries Commission.
Yes.
Commonwealth of Virginia.
Yes.
North Carolina.
Yes.
South Carolina.
Yes.
Georgia.
Yes.
Florida.
Yes.
National Marine Fisheries Service.
Yes.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Yes.
That motion carries by a vote of 15 in favor, 2 in opposition. The amended motion on the floor, give us just a moment. Can staff get us that? Professor Hasbrook, you said you wanted to come back and comments while we're getting staff, while getting the substitute motion on the floor, on the board, excuse me. Do you have comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I said, I was prepared to offer an amendment to the, which I guess now is to the amended substitute motion. And is what's on the board where we are with this right now? Is that the correct wording?
Yes, the motion on the floor, which is an amended substitute for discussion purposes, let's call this a substitute motion to the original one made by Dr. Daniel. The motion before the board now is moved to substitute the TAC at 187,880 metric tons for 2015 and 2016, and initiate Amendment 3 to the Atlantic Menhaden Fishery Management Plan to establish ecological reference points and to review state allocation as required by Amendment 2. This amended motion was made by Mr. Nowalski and seconded by Mr. Train. Ms. Fegley.
So,
I'm sorry. Professor Hasbrook.
Yes, I was prepared to make an amendment. And I just wanted clarification on what the substitute motion is. So,
proceed.
Can I? Thank you. So my amendment would be to pull out where it says, and to review state allocation as required by Amendment 2. I guess I would just put a period after reference points.
So
and then say to initiate an addendum to review state allocation to include a possible coastal bait small vessel allocation.
Is that a motion?
Yes.
Motion by Dr. Hasbrook. Is there a second? Let's hang on a second. Let's put it on the board. Emerson, just a second. Emerson, would you repeat that, please?
Yes. So we would, where it says to establish ecological reference points, period, and then add to review state allocation to include a possible coastal bait small vessel allocation. I don't know that we need as required by Amendment 2 in there.
We have a motion. Did I see a second? I don't see a second. Motion dies for lack of a second. Ms. Fegley.
I was going to move to divide this question, but I think we have to get back to the main motion first. Correct?
Time out. Dr. Daniel.
Just a real quick point on this motion, and I want to make sure it's clear that the assessment does have some positive trends. There are uncertainties, but I do believe there's room to increase harvest. But what the motion does here is it really doesn't address our problem, because we need to get the allocation right. Otherwise, 83 or 85% of this increase goes to one group, and it doesn't do anything to address my bait issues and probably anyone else's. So that's my main concern. It's not increasing the quota if that's justified. It's getting the allocation scheme right before we start increasing again.
Ms. Fegley, I think we're okay dividing the motion with the quota in one motion and allocation and ecosystem in a second motion. So I would rule such a motion in order.
Do I need to say something? Or
I really do. Yes, ma'am. Please.
Okay. I move to divide the question so that the TAC specifications are in one motion, and the second motion deals with ecological reference points and allocation.
The second, many times I see, Marty, second. Motion to divide. Discussion on the motion to divide. I see none. Do we need time to caucus? Yeah, let's put it up on the board. Thank you, Dave. Y'all, where we are, our executive director just reminded me, remember, this is a substitute motion. And so the motion to divide the substitute motion, we will still have some, we've got to figure out how this crosswalks with the main motion. So the motion is to divide so that the TAC of 187,880 metric tons for 2015 and 2016 is in one motion, and a second motion initiates a management action for development of ecological reference points and an allocation plan. Ms. Fegley, was that your motion?
Yes.
And that was a management action, not an addendum or an amendment? Because I think there's going to be some discussion about this. Okay, excuse me, you're right. I'm going to designate the New Hampshire delegation as the parliamentarians for the Menhaden board. Thank you. Ms. Fegley, can you confirm, could you read that into the record, please? If it's to your liking.
Okay. Move to divide the motion so the TAC of 187,880 metric tons for 2015 and 2016 is one motion, and the second motion would be to initiate an amendment for the development of ERPs and allocation.
Motion by Ms. Fegley, seconded by Mr. Gary. Discussion on that motion. Mr. Nowalski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While I don't claim to have the parliamentary experience of New Hampshire, I would certainly believe that this motion would be best addressed after we voted on the motion to substitute, and this then became the main motion, or we went back to the original. The parliamentary decision tree that we would have to go through of dividing this and dealing with it, I think would really set us back at this point.
I see a hand over here. Mr. Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share some of the parliamentary concerns, but notwithstanding that point, I support what the intent is here. The intent is these are two separate issues. I think we should take the two separate issues and divide them basically, and then vote them up or down. Now, whether we do that now or we go back and change the ruling that was previously made and change the order of the decision doesn't make any difference. But the advantage of this strategy is it gets exactly to some of the points that were raised before. Is it's a question of whether or not we want to pursue an amendment on the state quota issues or an addendum. One is a lot faster than the other. Thank you.
Thank you, and I apologize for my parliamentary inartfulness. I think where we are here is we have a motion to divide. In essence, what the board is considering are two issues here. One is a TAC, and there are on the floor two numbers for TAC. I also see and hear the board indicating some interest in moving down the development of a plan, a management action, an amendment, an addenda to develop ecological reference points and allocation. It would be my intent at this point, should this motion carry, to take a vote immediately on initiating an amendment to develop ecological reference points. Should that motion carry, actually regardless of whether that motion carries, we will then move to the second half of the divided question, which will in essence be a question of, do you believe it appropriate to have a TAC in 2015 and 2016 of 187,880 metric tons, or do you believe it to be more appropriate to stay status quo? Adam, I agree with you. I'm not sure we're here and Mr. Borden in the most expeditious parliamentary procedure, but that would be my intention in proceeding should this vote prevail. Any questions or discussion? Seeing none, time to caucus. Seeing none, all those in favor of the motion to divide signify by raising your right hand. In favor, motion in favor to divide signify by raising your right hand. That motion carries. Please put your hands down. Now, a division of the question is to initiate, I would take a motion, rather, to initiate the development of Amendment 3 to the Atlantic Menhaden Fishery Management Plan for the development of ecological reference points and allocation. I would look for a motion along those lines.
Point of order?
Yes, sir. Senator Water.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not a parliamentarian, but I do believe that the effect of passing the substitute motion is to put these two motions on the floor. So I think that we have to act on these before you can make another motion.
Thank you, Senator Waters. So the motion on the floor is to initiate Amendment 3 to the Atlantic Menhaden Fishery Management Plan for development of ecological reference points and allocation. Discussion on that motion. Mr. Adler.
Just a question here is an amendment, I think this was brought up before, is it an amendment we'd have to have or an addendum? And I don't know the answer to that. And I didn't know if maybe the wording could be to the point where it could be either one that we decide or somebody decides it has to be an amendment or it has to be an addendum. I know an addendum would be a lot quicker.
I'll turn to Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's really up to the board whether they'd like to act through an addendum or an amendment. Amendment 2 allows both of these topics to be changed through the adaptive management process, which would allow them to be changed through an addendum. However, as Dr. Daniel pointed out earlier, there is possibly some drive to do this through an amendment process because of how big the topics are.
Well, then should the motion say amendment or addendum?
Actually, yes, Mr. Adler, I was corrected about that when I suggested management action, but recall this origin is in the form of a substitute. So you go back to the original motion that was offered by Dr. Daniel, which references an amendment. So does everybody know where we are? Further discussion. Motion on the floor is moved to initiate Amendment 3 to the Atlantic Menhaden Fishery Management Plan for development of ecological reference points and allocation. All those in favor of that motion, please signify by raising your right hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 17. That's everybody. That motion carries unanimously. Now, if it pleases the board, we are back to a substitute motion to Dr. Daniel's original motion. And that substitute motion is in the form of a different number in terms of the TAC. I'd ask staff to put the original motion from Dr. Daniel as well as the move to substitute as well. And I will beg your forbearance if I have misinterpreted that, please raise your hand. Bob?
I think your advice is correct. You vote this motion, which is moved to substitute the TAC at 187,880 for 15 and 16. The board votes that up or down, and then those move forward. The portion that the board just approved, as well as the outcome of this, both those move forward as a substitute for the main original motion by Dr. Daniel.
Thank you, Bob. Does everybody know where we are? Now, the motion on the floor is a move to substitute the TAC at 187,880 metric tons for 2015 and 2016. This is a motion to substitute. Discussion on the motion. Do we need time to caucus? Yes, time to caucus. Take 2 minutes, please. Okay, the management board, direct your attention to the screen. The motion on the floor is a move to substitute the TAC at 187,880 metric tons for 2015 and 2016. All those in favor of that motion, please signify by raising your right hand. All those opposed, same sign. Raise your right hand. Abstentions? Null votes? Okay. That motion carries by a count of 12 in favor, 4 in opposition, and 1 null vote. Now, back to the main motion. We'll ask staff to get the main motion as amended back up on the screen. While staff is getting the motion on the screen, I appreciate y'all's forbearance with me in terms of traffic management. This has been a very good discussion. Certainly the members of the public, our constituents, thank you for the time that you've invested to come here. Thank you for your commitment to the resource and for your patience with me as chairman trying to work us through a very difficult and complicated discussion. It would be my suggestion that should this motion carry, which is now the main motion, that I, as the board chair, would work with commission leadership to develop a working group to put a framework around what certainly, as is evidence today, will be a very difficult and complicated conversation. This was, as you can see, as is obvious, I believe, to everyone in the room, a very difficult conversation, a very difficult decision. I appreciate the respect and the regard that was exhibited by all, certainly the board members as well as our guests. But I think this is something that if we, at least if I'm involved in the conversation, we may get wrapped around the parliamentary axle. So my suggestion would be I work with commission leadership to establish a working group to put a structure on this amendment and bring that back to the board at a future meeting date if not August, then the annual meeting, so that the board can approve the elements of what would be in this amendment. Is there any objection to that approach? I'm seeing heads nodding around the table. Ms. Fegley.
I don't have an objection to that approach, but I just wanted to place on the record, I think it's a wonderful idea, and that as we're working through that framework, and I think it reflects thoughts of other states around the table, that framework also include this idea that we look at these small capacity fleets and look at options for how to manage those on a different playing field. I just wanted to put that on the record. Thank you.
Mr. Borden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I totally agree with that comment, but I just voice a continuing concern here, and it goes back to the comment that Bob Beal made early on in the meeting, that if the second portion of this is an amendment, then the staff has to go through scoping and do all of the things that are clearly called for under an amendment. But we have the option of making that an addendum, and if we do that, we can address some of these concerns faster. So at least in my own perspective, I completely agree with your suggestion to form a working group, and if you're going to do that, I think the working group should have the ability to look at that specific question of whether or not we proceed with an amendment or an addendum, consult with staff, and then bring a recommendation back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Borden, for pointing that out. I think there's general agreement around the table. I'm seeing heads nod that we will task the working group with asking what the appropriate management measure may be, whether it's an addendum or an amendment. I'm getting concurrence, heads nodding around the table. The motion before us now on the floor, back to the very main motion, move that the Commission establish a coast-wide TAC at 187,880 metric tons for 2015 and 2016 to promote conservation and to initiate Amendment 3 to the Atlantic Menhaden Fishery Management Plan for the development of ecological reference points and allocation. Dr. Daniel made the original motion, which has been flogged. And I'm not sure I remember who made the second. There is no maker now. It belongs to the body. So the motion on the floor, do we need time to caucus? Yes, a moment to caucus, please.
New Hampshire.
Yes.
Commonwealth of Massachusetts.
Yes.
Rhode Island.
Yes.
Connecticut.
Yes.
New York.
Yes.
New Jersey.
Yes.
Delaware.
Yes.
Maryland.
Yes.
Potomac River Fisheries Commission.
Yes.
Commonwealth of Virginia.
Yes.
North Carolina.
Yes.
South Carolina.
Yes.
Georgia.
Yes.
Florida.
Yes.
National Marine Fisheries Service.
Yes.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
No.
That motion carries 16 votes in favor, 1 vote against. That takes us down to our, well, we kind of rolled in agenda item 8. Jeff, I'm sensitive to the question about research direction. I would ask that you would work with us on the working group, talk about that. At this point, is there any other business to come before the Menhaden Management Board? Okay. I will say this before I turn it over to Bob Beal, to our guests. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate your time and sharing with us your comments and your concerns about Atlantic Menhaden. The board meeting, before anybody stands up, we've got an announcement for Bob. So our business is over.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just real quickly, since we're about an hour behind, the South Atlantic Board is going to start essentially as quick as we can. There is lunch out in the hallway for commissioners And proxies, sorry, our friends in the audience, we didn't plan on buying you guys lunch. Apologize for that. But commissioners and proxies, and I'd ask that the South Atlantic board members be allowed to get in line first so they can grab their lunch, get back in here. The presenter from the Southeast Regional Office has a real tight timeline, and so she'll need to hop a plane very quickly. So we're going to try to make up some time. We'll shave off a few minutes of